After my husband completely wiped out my life savings to fund his secret life, the husband of the woman he was sleeping with approached me. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I have $680 million. Just say yes, and tomorrow we will sign at the courthouse." I thought my life was over, but I was about to gain the ultimate leverage. My name is Maya. I am 35 years old, and I built a premier boutique event planning agency in Atlanta from absolutely nothing. Before I share how I burned their perfect world to the ground, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to build yourself back up after the person you trusted most tried to break you. The air conditioning in my forensic accountant's office hummed with a low, steady drone that sounded exactly like a ticking clock marking the end of my life as I knew it. I sat perfectly still in the stiff leather chair staring at the glowing computer screen on the heavy mahogany desk. My accountant David pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and pointed a trembling finger at the final row of digits on the spreadsheet. The numbers glared back at me in stark red font. $250,000. Gone. That was my entire operating capital. That was the life savings I had bled for over the last 10 years. It was the payroll for my 12 dedicated employees, the massive vendor deposits for 3 upcoming corporate galas, and the safety net I had meticulously woven to protect myself from ever returning to the financial struggles of my childhood. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, so hard my knuckles turned pale against my dark skin. I asked David to refresh the screen to check the routing numbers again, to tell me that the bank had made a catastrophic error. But David just looked at me with an expression of profound pity that made my stomach twist into tight, heavy knots. The money had been wired out in 3 separate transactions over the past 48 hours, directly to a Shell Limited Liability Company. I had not authorized a single penny of it. My chest tightened, and the room suddenly felt entirely too small. I demanded to know where my money went. David began typing rapidly, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he traced the digital footprint of the wire transfers. He pulled up state business registry records and cross-referenced the routing data. The Shell company was registered just 3 days ago. When he pulled up the managing member's name, the breath completely left my lungs. Julian, my husband, the man I had shared my bed with for 8 years, the man I had kissed goodbye this very morning while he adjusted his tailored silk tie and told me he had a long day of property showings ahead of him. David continued to dig, tracing the IP address from the final transfer authorization. The location pinged to a high-end luxury high-rise condominium building right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I stared at the address on the screen, trying to force my brain to process the impossible information. Julian was a real estate broker, a highly ambitious, charismatic broker who was obsessed with closing million-dollar deals and climbing the corporate ladder. My mind began to frantically spin a web of rationalizations to protect my heart from the creeping dread. This had to be a mistake, a massive, incredibly reckless financial mistake. Julian must have found a commercial property he wanted to flip and needed the cash immediately to secure the deal. He was always talking about making bold moves in the market. Yes, it was a gross violation of my trust to use my business accounts, but surely there was a logical business explanation. I thanked David, grabbed my designer handbag, and practically ran out of the sterile office building into the sweltering Georgia heat. When I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely put the key in the ignition. The leather steering wheel burned against my palms as I pulled out onto Peachtree Street. The memories of our marriage flooded my mind, playing like a bitter movie montage against the backdrop of the crawling Atlanta traffic. I had built my boutique event planning agency from scratch, pouring every ounce of my creativity and resilience into my business. When Julian and I first met, he was working a dead-end retail job and dreaming of breaking into the exclusive Atlanta real estate market. He had the charm and the gorgeous smile, but he lacked the capital and the discipline to make it happen. I was the one who provided everything. I paid our rent for the first 4 years. I paid for our groceries, our utilities, and his car insurance. I paid the steep tuition for his real estate licensing exams and spent countless hours quizzing him on property laws late into the night when I was already exhausted from managing my own clients. When he finally got his license, I took thousands of dollars out of my personal savings to buy him 3 custom-tailored suits so he could look the part of a high-rolling broker during his interviews. I sacrificed my own luxuries, skipping vacations and putting every spare dollar back into my business and his career. I smiled through the sheer exhaustion because I believed Julian and I were a team, building a legacy together. I even tolerated his incredibly toxic family for the sake of our marriage. I endured his mother Beatrice, who constantly treated me like a walking bank account. She would demand that I pay for Julian's expensive celebratory dinners and constantly reminded me that her golden boy son was destined for greatness, as if I was merely a stepping stone on his path to success. I swallowed my pride when dealing with his entitled white brother-in-law Greg, who married Julian's sister Kendra. Greg constantly dismissed my highly profitable agency as just throwing little parties for women, while he and Julian discussed what they considered real wealth and real business. Julian never once defended me when Greg sneered at my work. I excused it all because I loved my husband and trusted our partnership. Now that partnership was missing $250,000, and I was driving toward a luxury building to demand answers. The traffic on the interstate was agonizingly slow, but my foot pressed heavy on the gas pedal whenever a gap opened up in the sea of cars. The towering Atlanta skyline loomed ahead of me, its glass facades glittering blindingly in the midday sun. I navigated the congested downtown streets with a singular, intense focus until I pulled up to the sleek, imposing structure of the condominium building David had traced the IP address to. The uniform-clad valet rushed forward to open my door, but I completely ignored his polite greeting, tossing him my keys and marching straight through the revolving glass doors. The massive marble lobby echoed with the sharp, authoritative clicking of my heels. I approached the concierge desk, flashing my most commanding professional smile, the one I reserved for difficult event vendors. I demanded the unit number registered to Julian, projecting an air of absolute certainty. The concierge hesitated for a fraction of a second, but my tone left absolutely no room for debate. He gave me the penthouse unit number, and I stepped into the mirrored elevator, pressing the top button with a trembling finger. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, desperately trying to escape. I watched the digital floor numbers climb higher and higher, taking deep, steadying breaths. I was preparing my speech mentally, drafting the exact words I would use to scold my husband for his reckless investment strategy. I was preparing to be fiercely angry, but ultimately forgiving. I was preparing to confront a foolish, overly ambitious businessman who had made a terrible, uncalculated risk. I reached the penthouse level and stepped out into the quiet, opulent hallway, staring at the heavy wooden door that stood between me and my missing life savings. I raised my hand to knock, firmly convinced that I was about to have a very difficult conversation about financial boundaries. I had absolutely no idea that the door I was about to open would shatter my reality forever, tear down the entire foundation of my life, and introduce me to a betrayal so deep it would change the trajectory of my entire existence. I did not knock. The heavy mahogany door to the penthouse was resting slightly ajar, likely left open for room service or a private delivery. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I raised my foot and kicked the door open with the heel of my boot. The solid wood slammed violently against the expensive drywall with a resounding crack that echoed through the cavernous living space. I marched inside, the sharp clicking of my heels announcing my arrival like a war drum. The penthouse was a monument to absolute excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline, casting a golden afternoon light over imported Italian marble floors and sleek modern furniture. It was the exact kind of high-rolling aesthetic Julian had always lusted after, but could never afford on his own. Julian was standing by a massive quartz kitchen island. He did not jump. He did not scramble. He simply turned around slowly, holding a crystal champagne flute. He was wearing a custom-tailored silk robe, the exact same robe I had purchased for him as an anniversary gift just 2 months prior. And then I saw her, Chloe. She was lounging casually on a pristine white leather sectional sofa in the center of the room. She was impeccably styled, her hair cascading in perfect waves, wearing a silk slip dress that left nothing to the imagination. She had the unmistakable energy of a professional social climber, someone who fed on the status of the men she attached herself to. She crossed her long legs completely unbothered by my sudden violent entrance and took a slow, deliberate sip from her own crystal flute. She was drinking vintage champagne that I had undoubtedly paid for with the sweat and tears of my business. $250,000, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that I hardly recognized as my own. I did not scream. I did not cry. I stared directly into Julian's eyes. Where is my money, Julian? Where is the operating capital for my agency? Julian set his glass down on the quartz island with a soft clink. He did not cower. He did not offer a frantic string of apologies or excuses. Instead, he smiled. It was the same charismatic, arrogant smile he used to close real estate deals, a smile that completely disregarded the devastation he had just caused. He walked toward me slowly, radiating the swagger of an untouchable king rather than a man caught embezzling his wife's life savings. Maya, you are overreacting as usual, Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. You need to calm down and look at the bigger picture. I am not stealing from you. I am investing. Investing. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. You wired $250,000 to a shell company to buy a penthouse for your mistress, and you have the audacity to call it an investment. Chloe shifted on the white leather sofa, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. She rested her champagne glass against her knee and looked at me with an expression of pure pity. She is not a mistress, Maya, Julian corrected, stepping closer to Chloe and resting his hand possessively on her shoulder. Chloe and I are building a future together. A real future. We are elevating our lives. You have always been so small-minded with money, hoarding cash in savings accounts like a terrified amateur. Real wealth is built on leverage and bold moves. This luxury condo is a prime asset. It is an appreciating property in the hottest market in Atlanta. I stared at the man I had supported for 8 years, feeling a profound, sickening disconnect. This was the man whose car insurance I had paid. This was the man whose licensing exams I had funded. Now he was standing in a multi-million-dollar penthouse lecturing me about real wealth while spending the very money I had earned to finance his infidelity. You committed fraud, Julian, I stated coldly, refusing to let him see the heartbreak threatening to tear my chest apart. That money was earmarked for my vendor payroll. It was meant to secure the venues for 3 massive corporate galas next month. You have jeopardized the livelihoods of my 12 employees and completely bankrupted my agency. I want every single cent wired back into my business account by the end of business today, or I am going straight to the police. Chloe rolled her eyes and took another long sip of her champagne. Julian is a financial visionary, Maya, she sneered, her voice laced with elite arrogance. You should honestly be thanking him for taking the initiative to secure your financial portfolio. Left to your own devices, you would just keep planning your little parties until you turned gray. Julian is operating on a completely different level now. A level you clearly do not have the intellect to comprehend. The sheer audacity of her words felt like a physical blow. This woman, who contributed absolutely nothing to my marriage or my bank accounts, was sitting in a penthouse funded by my labor and mocking my intelligence. I ignored her completely, keeping my intense focus locked entirely on Julian. The police, Julian, I warned, taking a step forward. Embezzlement, grand larceny, wire fraud. You are a licensed real estate broker. Do you have any idea what a federal investigation will do to your precious career? I will see you stripped of your license and thrown in a federal prison before I let you walk away with my life savings. Julian laughed. He actually threw his head back and laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He crossed his arms over his silk robe and looked down at me with absolute icy disdain. You are not going to the police, Maya, he said, his voice dropping into a threatening sneer. Because you cannot. We are legally married. Those accounts are joint marital assets. I have every legal right to transfer funds within my own marriage to secure real estate investments. My lawyers will tie you up in civil court for a decade before you ever see a courtroom. And by the time the dust settles, my investment on this property will have tripled. I took a step closer, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me into submission. Your little party planning business will survive, he mocked coldly. Just go book a few more weddings. Smile for your clients, bake a few more cakes, but leave the real wealth management to the men who actually know how to build empires. Go back to throwing parties, Maya. Because you are never getting that money back. Not a single cent. I stood frozen in the center of the immaculate living room, the reality of his trap snapping shut around me. He had weaponized our marriage against me. He had used the legal protections of our union to legally drain my accounts, knowing that the police would likely view it as a civil marital dispute rather than a clear-cut criminal theft. He had planned this meticulously, waiting until my agency accounts were at their highest seasonal peak before striking. Chloe stood up from the sofa, smoothing down the silk of her dress. She walked over to the kitchen island and poured herself another glass of my champagne. "We have a dinner reservation in an hour." "Julian," she murmured, completely dismissing my presence as if I were nothing more than a minor annoyance blocking their view of the city. "We should start getting ready." Julian did not even look at me as he turned back toward his mistress. "You know your way out, Maya," he dismissed over his shoulder. "Close the door behind you. Do not make a scene on your way through the lobby. It is embarrassing." I did not scream. I did not throw the crystal champagne flutes against the wall. I did not give them the satisfaction of watching me break down into a hysterical weeping mess. I realized in that precise, agonizing moment that emotional reactions were useless against people who completely lacked a moral compass. They expected me to crumble, to beg, to negotiate for scraps of my own money. Instead, I turned my back on them. I walked out of the penthouse, my heels clicking against the marble floors, with the exact same steady, authoritative rhythm I had entered with. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me, the lock clicking securely into place. I stepped into the mirrored elevator and watched the doors slide shut, cutting off the view of the hallway. As the elevator descended rapidly toward the ground floor, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, terrifying numbness. I was bankrupt. I was utterly betrayed. My business was on the verge of total collapse, and the man I loved had orchestrated the entire destruction with a smirk on his face. I needed to go home. I needed to pack my things, secure whatever minor assets I had left hidden in my personal safe, and formulate a survival plan before Julian could inflict any more damage. I walked out of the lobby and climbed back into my car, gripping the steering wheel as I drove back towards the suburban house I shared with my husband. I braced myself for the monumental task of rebuilding my life from zero, completely unaware that the nightmare was far from over. I was driving straight into another trap, because Julian's highly toxic family was already waiting for me in my own living room. The drive back to the suburbs felt like navigating through thick mud. My mind raced with checklists and survival strategies. I needed to pack my most essential clothes, grab my passport, and most importantly, empty the small fireproof safe hidden in the back of my walk-in closet. I kept roughly $10,000 in emergency cash there, along with my original business incorporation documents. It was not enough to save my agency, but it was enough to hire a vicious divorce attorney and secure a hotel room for the next month. I pulled into the driveway of the 4-bedroom house I had purchased with my own down payment. Julian's car was nowhere to be seen, but a massive silver SUV was parked illegally across the curb. Greg's car. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, expecting the familiar quiet of my home. Instead, I was hit with the sharp, distinct scent of Beatrice's heavy floral perfume. My stomach plummeted. I walked slowly into the foyer, dropping my keys onto the console table. Voices echoed from the formal living room. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Beatrice was sitting on my custom-upholstered velvet sofa, holding a cup of tea, as if she were waiting for a casual afternoon visit. She wore a pristine pearl necklace and a patronizing smile. Standing by the fireplace inspecting one of my expensive vases was Greg. He wore his usual arrogant smirk, dressed in a crisp polo shirt and expensive loafers. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. In fact, they looked incredibly prepared. "Maya, darling," Beatrice cooed, setting her teacup down on the glass coffee table. "Julian called us. He said you had a bit of a dramatic episode downtown. We came over to make sure you were not going to do anything irrational." I stared at the woman who had happily accepted my expensive gifts and free dinners for the last 8 years. "I am not having a dramatic episode, Beatrice. Your son just embezzled $250,000 from my business accounts to buy a penthouse for his mistress. He committed fraud." Beatrice sighed deeply, adjusting her pearls. She looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. You are using such ugly words, Maya. Embezzlement. Fraud. Marriage is a partnership. Julian is simply shifting family resources to secure a better financial portfolio for your future. He has vision. He always has. You should be thanking him for taking the initiative instead of bursting into his business meetings and making a scene. Business meetings. I repeated, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. He was in a silk robe drinking champagne with another woman. Boys will be boys, Maya Beatrice said, brushing off my pain with a casual wave of her hand. Successful men have distractions. It is a misstep, nothing more. A good wife understands the pressures of a high-level career. A good wife stands by her man, forgives his little indiscretions, and supports his financial vision. You have always been so rigid, so focused on your little event planning company. Julian is trying to build generational wealth. You need to stop being so selfish and look at the bigger picture. I felt a sickening wave of revulsion. She was actually defending him. She was rationalizing theft and infidelity as if they were minor character quirks of a successful man. Before I could respond, Greg chuckled from the fireplace. He set the vase down and turned to face me, shoving his hands into his pockets. Beatrice is right, Maya. You are completely overreacting. You do not understand how high-level real estate plays work. Julian is leveraging capital to secure a prime asset. That penthouse is going to double in value within 5 years. Greg walked toward me, his height making him tower over my frame. He looked down at me with the same condescending sneer he used at every Thanksgiving dinner when I talked about my agency. You lack the intellect to grasp the complexity of what Julian is doing. Greg continued, his voice dripping with elite arrogance. You throw parties for a living. You order balloons and catering. That is cute, but it is not real business. Julian is swimming with sharks now. High is orchestrating massive wealth transfers. You should step aside and let the men handle the actual wealth management. If you start screaming to the authorities, you are just going to ruin his career and destroy your own marriage. You are an accomplice, I said, staring daggers into Greg's pale blue eyes. You know exactly what he did. You probably helped him hide the money. Greg smirked, leaning in slightly. Prove it. Julian is the primary account holder on your joint marital assets. He has full legal authorization to move those funds wherever he sees fit. You gave him that power when you married him. You played yourself, Maya. I shoved past Greg, refusing to engage with his taunts any longer. I marched straight down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I needed my emergency cash. I needed my documents. I threw open the closet door and dropped to my knees, spinning the dial on the heavy metal safe hidden behind my shoe rack. I input the code. Nothing happened. A red light flashed, indicating an incorrect password. My hands started to shake. I typed the code again, pressing the numbers harder. Red light. Access denied. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. I turned to see Greg leaning against the bedroom doorframe, jingling his car keys. Julian changed the code this morning, Greg stated casually. He figured you might come running back here trying to hoard cash. He also froze your secondary credit cards. You might want to check your banking app, Maya. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I pulled my phone from my pocket and frantically opened my banking application. My thumb authenticated the login, but instead of my usual dashboard, a red error message popped up. Account access suspended. Please contact your branch administrator. I switched to my personal checking account. The balance read $0.00. I checked my business lines of credit. Maxed out. Julian had not just drained my operating capital. He had systematically locked me out of every single financial resource I possessed. He had stripped me bare. You have nothing left, Greg said, watching my face drain of color. Julian holds all the cards. If you play nice and apologize for your little outburst today, he might give you a small allowance to keep your party business afloat. But if you try to fight him, he will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street. Beatrice appeared in the hallway behind Greg, holding her purse. We are going to leave now, Maya, she said, her voice completely devoid of empathy. I suggest you use this evening to calm down and reflect on your behavior. A wife does not tear down her husband. When Julian comes home, you will apologize. You will support his investments. And you will drop this nonsense about the police. If you ruin my son's career, I will personally see to it that you never work in Atlanta again. They turned and walked away, leaving me kneeling on the floor of my own closet. I listened to the front door open and click shut. I heard the heavy engine of Greg's SUV roar to life and fade down the street. The house was completely silent, but the silence was suffocating. I stood up slowly, my knees aching. I looked around the beautiful bedroom I had furnished, the home I had paid, the mortgage on the life I had built piece by piece. It was all a prison. Julian had meticulously planned my destruction. He had used my love, my trust, and my financial success to fund his new life with Chloe, leaving me with absolutely nothing. I had no cash. I had no access to my credit. I had no way to pay my employees or my vendors. I was utterly and completely ruined. I grabbed a single duffel bag from the top shelf. I did not bother packing dresses or jewelry. I packed basic survival items. A few pairs of jeans, heavy sweaters, my laptop, and my phone charger. I walked through the house, turning off the lights, realizing I might never step foot in this building again. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me, stepping out into the fading evening light. I climbed into my car and tossed the duffel bag into the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly through the windshield at the quiet suburban street. I had nowhere to go. I could not afford a hotel. I could not show my face at my office, knowing I could not make payroll tomorrow. I felt a crushing wave of despair wash over me, threatening to pull me under completely. I rested my forehead against the cool leather of the steering wheel, closing my eyes. I was broke. I was homeless. I was a laughingstock to my husband's family. I had hit rock bottom. I took a deep, ragged breath, preparing to start the engine and drive aimlessly into the night. I did not know how I was going to survive tomorrow. I did not know how I was going to fight back against a man who held all the legal cards. But as I reached for the ignition, a shadow fell across my windshield, blocking out the streetlights. I lifted my head, my eyes widening in shock. A sleek, immaculate black Maybach had just silently rolled to a stop right in front of my driveway, blocking my exit. The tinted rear passenger door slowly swung open. A tall man stepped out from the back seat of the Maybach. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that screamed custom bespoke. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, illuminated briefly by the street lamp before he crossed into the shadows of my driveway. I froze, my hand hovering over the ignition, my heart pounding against my ribs. For a wild second, I thought Julian had sent someone to intimidate me. But as the man stepped closer to my driver's side window, the ambient light caught his features. How was an African-American man, perhaps, in his early 40s, with striking silver at his temples and a jawline carved from granite. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely focused on me. He raised a hand and tapped twice on my glass. The sound was sharp and commanding. I hesitated, my survival instincts warring with my desperate need for answers. I lowered the window just an inch, bracing myself for whatever threat was coming. "Unlock the door, Maya," he said. His voice was a deep, rich baritone, completely devoid of malice but leaving no room for argument. "We have business to discuss." "I do not know who you are," I replied, keeping my hand near the door lock. "And I have nothing left for Julian to take, so whatever message he sent you to deliver, you can tell him he already won." A faint, humorless smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Julian did not send me. Julian is currently operating under the delusion that he is the smartest man in Atlanta. My name is Sterling. I am Chloe's husband." The name hit me like a physical shockwave. Sterling, the billionaire venture capitalist, the man whose wealth funded the designer clothes, the vintage champagne, and the arrogant smirk I had just witnessed in that downtown penthouse. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process why a man of his immense stature was standing in the humid Georgia evening air, tapping on the window of my beat-up sedan. I hit the unlock button. Sterling walked around the front of my car and slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the faint scent of expensive cedar and crisp winter air. He filled the small space of my vehicle, completely altering the atmosphere from a tomb of despair into a war room. He did not offer a sympathetic smile. He did not ask how I was holding up. He simply adjusted his cuffs and looked straight through the windshield at my dark, locked house. "You look like a woman who just realized her entire foundation was built on sand," Sterling stated bluntly. I recognized the expression. I wore it myself about 4 months ago when my private investigators handed me a folder containing photographs of my wife entering various hotel rooms with your husband. "You have known for 4 months?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "You knew they were sleeping together and you did nothing." "I did not do nothing, Maya. I did what any rational investor does when they spot a liability. I audited my portfolio." Sterling turned his head to look at me, his dark eyes piercing through my confusion. "Emotional outbursts are for amateurs. Screaming and breaking china only gives the enemy a warning. I spent the last 120 days quietly, methodically severing Chloe's access to my primary capital. I froze her offshore accounts. I removed her authorization from my holding companies. I legally trapped her in a gilded cage while she thought she was outsmarting me." My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Then why are you here? If you already secured your assets and cornered your wife, why track me down in the middle of the night?" "Because your husband found a blind spot," Sterling replied, his tone sharpening. "Julian is a parasite, but I will concede that he is a highly motivated parasite." When Chloe realized her platinum cards were suddenly declining, she panicked. She complained to Julian that I was tightening the leash. Julian, sensing that his meal ticket was in jeopardy, decided to play the hero. But Julian does not have capital. He has an inflated salary and a mountain of credit card debt. So he looked for the nearest available liquidity. He looked at me. I whispered, the reality of my husband's betrayal cementing itself permanently in my brain. He looked at my business accounts. "Exactly." Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek tablet, waking the screen with a tap. He pulled up a complex financial flowchart and rested it on the center console between us. Julian needed to secure a nest egg for Chloe. Something untouchable. Something that I could not seize in a divorce settlement, and something that you could not claim in a marital dispute. So he orchestrated a ghost transaction. I leaned over, looking at the glowing screen. The flowchart detailed the exact routing numbers David, my accountant, had shown me hours earlier. "Your $250,000 was not just moved into a random limited liability company," Sterling explained, pointing to the red lines connecting the digital boxes. "Julian structured that shell corporation under Chloe's maiden name. He used your operating capital to purchase that downtown penthouse outright in cash. No mortgage, no bank liens. It is a clean, untraceable asset sitting exclusively in Chloe's name." I felt a wave of profound nausea wash over me. I shook my head, trying to reject the sheer evil of the financial maneuver. "That makes no sense. If he put it in her name, he has no legal claim to it. He gave away my money to a woman who is married to you." Sterling nodded, a glint of predatory respect in his eyes. "It is brilliant in its absolute depravity. By putting the asset in Chloe's maiden name, Julian removed it from your marital estate. If you divorce Julian, he can claim he lost the money in a bad business deal, leaving you with nothing to collect. Meanwhile, because Chloe used third-party funds to acquire the property and not a single cent of my money, it is legally shielded from our prenuptial agreement. It is a completely isolated asset. Julian created a safe haven for them to live in where neither you nor I can legally touch them." I stared at the tablet, my chest heaving as the oxygen seemed to evaporate from the car. The cruelty was surgical. Julian had not acted out of sudden passion or impulse. He had sat at our kitchen table drinking the coffee I brewed, kissing my cheek, and meticulously plotting how to legally rob me to build a fortress for his mistress. He had used my sweat, my late nights, my sacrifices to buy a concrete shield against my own retribution. "Greg knew," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper as the puzzle pieces finally snapped together. "Julian's brother-in-law. He was in my living room tonight telling me I lacked the intellect to understand real estate plays. He was mocking me because he knew exactly how Julian hid the money." Sterling turned off the tablet screen, plunging the car back into shadows. Of course Greg knew. Greg is a failing commercial broker drowning in bad debt. He idolizes Julian's ability to manipulate people. Your husband's entire family views you as a host organism, Maya. You provide the nutrients. They consume the harvest. When the host runs dry, they simply detach and find a new food source. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying was for victims, and I was rapidly realizing that playing the victim would equal my total destruction. I swallowed the lump in my throat, sitting up straighter against the worn fabric of my car seat. So they got away with it. I stated, the anger finally replacing the despair. They found the legal loophole. They drained me dry, and they bought their untouchable castle. Why are you telling me all this, Sterling? To gloat, to show me how much smarter you are than the woman who just lost everything. Sterling let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. I am telling you this, Maya, because Julian made one fatal miscalculation in his grand architectural masterpiece of fraud. What miscalculation? I asked, turning to face him fully. How underestimated my ego. Sterling said, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. Julian assumed that because I am a public figure, because I manage billions of dollars in institutional capital, I would handle my divorce quietly. He assumed I would slap a gag order on Chloe, hand her a modest severance package to avoid bad press, and walk away. He assumed I would consider a $250,000 penthouse a rounding error not worth my time. Sterling leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. I do not do rounding errors, Maya. And I absolutely do not allow mediocre real estate brokers to sleep with my wife and finance it with stolen money under my nose. Julian thinks he outsmarted a billionaire. I am going to teach him what real wealth can do to a man who steps out of his weight class. I stared at him, realizing that the man sitting in my passenger seat was not a grieving husband seeking comfort. He was a general preparing for total war, and he had come to my driveway because he needed a soldier who knew the enemy terrain. You are going to destroy him, I said, the words tasting like sweet poison on my tongue. We are going to destroy him, Sterling corrected smoothly. I have the capital. I have the corporate attorneys. I have the influence to blacklist Julian from every major brokerage firm in the Southern Hemisphere. But I do not have access to his internal family dynamics. I do not have the keys to his specific vulnerabilities. You do. You spent 8 years subsidizing that entire parasitic family. You know where their bodies are buried. You know their insecurities. You know exactly what makes them bleed. Howe was right. I knew that Greg was terrified of his own financial incompetence being exposed. I knew that Beatrice valued her country club status more than she valued her own children. I knew that Julian required constant external validation and that his entire career rested on a fragile house of cards built entirely on charm and stolen resources. I had the blueprints to their destruction mapped out in my mind. I just lacked the dynamite. I looked at the imposing black Maybach idling in the street behind us, its engine humming with quiet, unlimited power. Then I looked back at Sterling. The despair that had paralyzed me just an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, highly focused clarity. You said you froze Chloe's assets, I said, my voice calm and analytical. But Julian still has his job. He is angling for a senior partnership. He thinks he won today. He thinks I am going to crawl into a corner and cry while he pops champagne in my penthouse. Sterling smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes. It was a terrifying, glorious expression. Let him drink the champagne tonight, Maya. Let him celebrate his brilliant investment. Let him sleep soundly next to my wife, believing he holds all the cards. Tomorrow morning we change the rules of the game. I took a deep breath, the humid Georgia air suddenly feeling crisp and clean in my lungs. I was bankrupt. I was homeless. My marriage was a complete sham. But sitting next to me was a man with unlimited resources and a shared thirst for absolute ruinous justice. I am listening, I said. Tell me the plan. Sterling did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or false comfort. He reached into the interior breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a thick, precisely bound stack of legal documents. He held the heavy premium paper in his hands for a fraction of a second before reaching forward and sliding the entire dossier across the dashboard of my car. The thick packet came to rest right above my steering wheel, illuminating slightly under the amber glow of the nearest street lamp. I have $680 million in verifiable liquid and semi-liquid assets, Maya. Sterling stated, his deep voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. in the confined space of my sedan. I do not play defense, and I do not allow thieves to dictate the terms of my life. I am offering you a strictly legal and highly strategic alliance. Read the documents. Just say yes, and tomorrow morning we will walk into the Fulton County Courthouse and sign these papers into public record. I stared at the thick stack of legal paper resting on my dashboard. My hands were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of my confrontation with Julian and the subsequent ambush by Beatrice and Greg, but I forced myself to reach out and pick up the dossier. I clicked on the overhead dome light of my car, bathing the front seats in a harsh yellow glow. I am a businesswoman who built a highly profitable event planning agency from scratch. I am used to reading vendor contracts, liability waivers, and massive corporate invoices. But the document Sterling had just handed me was on an entirely different level of corporate warfare. This is not a divorce settlement, I noted, my eyes scanning the bold legal headers on the first page. No. Sterling leaned back against the passenger seat, watching me with a predatory calmness. Family court is a slaughterhouse for people like us. Julian wants to drag you into a bitter, prolonged marital dispute where he can hide behind Georgia community property laws. He wants to claim that taking your $250,000 was simply a husband managing joint marital assets. If you fight him in family court, you will bleed out in attorney fees over the next 5 years while he and Chloe sip champagne in that penthouse. We are not going to fight him in family court, Maya. We are going to rip him out of the domestic arena and drag him into the corporate meat grinder. I flipped to the second page of the contract, my heart hammering against my ribs as the sheer brilliance of Sterling's strategy began to unfold before my eyes. The document was a masterfully crafted venture capital acquisition agreement. Sterling was not offering me a loan to pay my rent or a shoulder to cry on. He was offering to weaponize my entire agency. According to the terms outlined in Section A, Sterling's venture capital firm would immediately purchase a controlling shadow interest in my boutique event planning agency. On paper, my company would instantly absorb an overwhelming amount of secured corporate debt owed directly to Sterling's holding company. It was a classic corporate poison pill. If Julian tries to claim half of your business in the divorce settlement, he will not be claiming half of your profits. Sterling explained, his voice low and razor-sharp. He will be claiming half of a multi-million-dollar corporate debt owed directly to me. If Julian touches your agency, he bankrupts himself instantly. He cannot liquidate your assets because I will legally own the lien on every single table chair and vendor contract you possess. I am building an impenetrable fortress around your livelihood. I felt a sudden sharp intake of breath as I read further down the page. Sterling was not just shielding me from Julian's greed. He was fully replacing the operating capital Julian had stolen. Section B of the contract outlined an immediate capital infusion of $750,000 transferred directly into a newly formed trust account that Julian could not legally access or even see. It was triple the amount my husband had embezzled. It was enough money to effortlessly cover my payroll, secure my upcoming corporate galas, and expand my agency beyond my wildest ambitions. What do you get out of this, Sterling? I asked, tearing my eyes away from the staggering numbers to look directly at the billionaire sitting next to me. A man with $680 million does not hand out corporate shields and $750,000 out of the goodness of his heart. You are a venture capitalist. You expect a massive return on your investment. What exactly is my end of this bargain? Sterling smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that perfectly matched the ruthless nature of the contract. Turn to page 9. I flipped through the thick, crisp pages until I reached the section he indicated. The header read, Information and Intelligence Sharing Clause. Chloe thinks she has outsmarted me because she used Julian's stolen funds to purchase that penthouse in her maiden name. Sterling stated, his gaze turning toward the dark street ahead. She plans to play the innocent spouse. When I divorce her, she will claim she had no idea Julian acquired that money illegally. She will claim it was a generous gift from a wealthy admirer protecting her new luxury asset from my legal team. I cannot prove she knowingly participated in wire fraud without an inside witness. You need me to testify against her. I realized the full scope of his plan falling into place. I need you to completely dismantle her defense, Sterling corrected. You have lived with Julian for 8 years. You have access to his home office, his secondary laptops, his deleted emails, and his physical schedules. You have the exact timelines of when he was supposedly working late to study for his real estate exams or attending broker networking events. I need every single piece of family leverage you possess. I need you to hand over the absolute undeniable proof that Chloe was actively conspiring with your husband to drain your business accounts. I provide the capital and the corporate shark attorneys to crush Julian. You provide the tactical intelligence I need to prove Chloe committed federal fraud. I sat back against my driver's seat, letting the heavy legal document rest on my lap. The sheer magnitude of the proposition washed over me. Just an hour ago, I was sitting in this exact spot, completely paralyzed by despair. I had been mocked in my own living room by Greg, who arrogantly told me I lacked the intellect to understand high-level real estate plays. I had been gaslighted by Beatrice, who demanded I apologize to the man who robbed me. I had been dismissed by Julian and his mistress as nothing more than a pathetic party planner who was destined to lose everything. Now a billionaire was sitting in my passenger seat offering me the keys to a nuclear arsenal. Tying my life and my business to a man as powerful and ruthless as Sterling was a massive risk. Once I signed this contract, I would be legally bound to his corporate empire. I would be handing over a significant portion of my independence to a man I had just met. But as I sat in the humid Georgia night, my mind flashed back to the smug, victorious sneer on Julian's face when he told me to go back to throwing parties. I remembered the sound of Chloe's mocking laughter echoing off the marble floors of that stolen penthouse. I thought about Greg jingling his car keys in my hallway, telling me Julian held all the cards and that I was going to end up on the street. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a host organism meant to be drained, discarded, and forgotten. They had systematically dismantled my life and expected me to stay silent and obedient. I reached into my purse and pulled out a heavy black ink pen. I do not just want my money back. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute unwavering certainty. I do not just want to survive this. Julian wants to be a senior partner at his brokerage firm. He cares about his reputation in the Atlanta real estate market more than he cares about anything else on this earth. Beatrice cares about her country club status. Greg cares about pretending he is a financial genius. If I sign this contract, we do not just divorce them. We take everything they value. We humiliate them in front of the city elite. We burn their entire world to the ground. Sterling watched me carefully, measuring the depth of my resolve. He saw the fire burning in my eyes and recognized a reflection of his own vengeance. We burn it to the ground, Maya. Sterling agreed, his deep voice sealing the pact. We stripped them of their assets, their reputations, and their pride. They wanted to play a high-level game of wealth management. We are going to show them how the real titans operate. I did not hesitate for another second. I placed the thick legal dossier flat against the dashboard of my car. I uncapped my pen and flipped to the final signature page. The dome light cast a sharp shadow over the paper as I pressed the pen to the designated line. I signed my name with bold, aggressive strokes, legally binding my agency, my assets, and my future to Sterling. The scratch of the pen against the premium paper was the loudest sound in the car. It sounded like the striking of a match. I handed the signed contract back to Sterling. He took it, placing it carefully back into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit. The transaction was complete. The alliance was forged. We were no longer just two betrayed spouses reeling from the devastation of infidelity. We were an unbreakable, ruthless partnership, armed with hundreds of millions of dollars and a highly synchronized strategy for total destruction. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, my legal team will take full control of your agency assets, Sterling said, opening the passenger door of my sedan. The fresh capital will be wired into your new secure trust by noon. Go to a hotel tonight, Maya. Rest, because tomorrow we start the war. I watched Sterling step out of my car and walk back toward the idling Maybach. The driver opened the rear door for him, and the luxury vehicle silently glided down the street, disappearing into the Atlanta night. I sat alone in my car, but I was no longer afraid. The crushing weight of bankruptcy and betrayal had been completely eradicated. Julian thought he had locked me out of my own life, but he had inadvertently handed me the keys to a kingdom. I started my engine, put the car in drive, and pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving my old life behind without a single glance in the rearview mirror. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta skyline when the sleek black town cars pulled up to the front entrance of my agency. I had spent the night in a luxury suite at the St. Regis paid for entirely by the newly established corporate trust. I walked into my office building at exactly 8:45 in the morning, holding a fresh cup of coffee and wearing a tailored emerald green suit that projected absolute authority. At 9 o'clock sharp, the glass doors to my lobby swung open. Sterling had not exaggerated when he promised corporate shark attorneys. A team of 5 lawyers led by a devastatingly sharp African-American man named Donovan marched into my conference room. They did not carry briefcases. They carried encrypted laptops and portable secure servers. Donovan handed me a steaming espresso and immediately got to work. For the next 3 hours, my conference room was transformed into a financial war room. We executed the poison pill strategy with surgical precision. Donovan systematically dismantled my original LLC, restructuring it to fall entirely under the umbrella of Sterling's primary holding company. I watched the digital monitors in real time as the staggering $750,000 capital infusion cleared into a newly minted ironclad corporate trust. It was an impenetrable financial fortress. Donovan placed a stack of injunctions and asset protection orders on the table, guiding my pen as I signed my name over and over again. By noon, every single vendor contract, every piece of office furniture, and every digital asset my agency possessed was legally shielded. If Julian even attempted to query my business accounts or file a marital claim against my company, he would instantly trigger a corporate lawsuit from a billionaire venture capital firm that would bury him in legal fees for the next decade. My business was no longer a vulnerable target. It was a fully weaponized asset. With my livelihood securely locked down, I turned my attention to the offensive strategy. I walked over to the massive acrylic calendar hanging on my office wall and circled a date exactly 2 weeks away. The Pinnacle Group Annual Charity Gala. It was the most exclusive high-stakes real estate event in the entire city of Atlanta. Every senior partner, every major investor, and every high-rolling broker would be in attendance. Julian had been campaigning for a senior partnership for 3 years, and being appointed as the head of the Gala Planning Committee was his golden ticket. If the event went flawlessly, he would secure his promotion, a massive bonus, and the prestige he craved. 6 months ago, Julian had smoothly convinced his partners to hire my agency to coordinate the entire affair. He had framed it as a brilliant synergy of family businesses, promising them a spectacular evening at a heavily discounted rate. What he had actually done was shift the entire financial liability of the gala onto my shoulders. When Julian drained my $250,000 of operating capital yesterday, he had perfectly calculated the fallout. I knew the massive vendor deposits for his gala were due this week. He expected my agency to default on the payments. He wanted to force me into a corner where I would have to take out ruinous personal loans just to save my professional reputation, effectively funding his corporate triumph while simultaneously driving myself into personal bankruptcy. He wanted me desperate, panicked, and entirely under his control. He had severely underestimated the amount of capital I now had at my disposal. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the master vendor file for the Pinnacle Group Gala. The event was scheduled to be held at the Grand Magnolia Conservatory, an elite, highly sought-after venue known for its glass ceilings and sprawling botanical gardens. Julian had booked the space, but the final non-refundable deposit to secure the exclusive venue rights was due by 5 o'clock today. I picked up my phone and dialed the venue director. I did not just pay the remaining balance. Using the unlimited resources of my new corporate trust, I bought out the exclusive event rights for the entire weekend. I restructured the contract so that the venue, the premium catering company, the specialized lighting crew, and the luxury valet service were all legally contracted directly to my new trust, not to Julian's brokerage firm. I effectively purchased absolute total control over the entire gala. Julian and his partners thought they were hosting the event of the season, but they were actually guests at my party. I held the keys to the venue, the food, the drinks, and the microphone. If I wanted to lock the doors and leave Atlanta's real estate elite standing on the sidewalk in their tuxedos, I had the legal authority to do so. But simply canceling the event would be letting Julian off the hook too easily. I did not want to cancel his moment in the spotlight. I wanted to hijack it. I spent the remainder of the afternoon meticulously coordinating with the audiovisual team. I requested a massive high-definition presentation screen to be installed directly behind the main podium, assuring the technicians that the Pinnacle Group partners had a very special, highly confidential presentation planned for the climax of the evening. I wired them an exorbitant bonus for their discretion and guaranteed cooperation. Every single detail was locked into place. The trap was set, baited, and heavily armed. At 4:30 in the afternoon, my personal cell phone buzzed against the surface of my desk. The screen lit up with Julian's name. I let it ring, watching the screen go dark. 10 seconds later, a text message illuminated the glass. Then another, and another. The notifications rapid-fired in quick succession, vibrating aggressively against the wood. I picked up the phone and unlocked the screen, leaning back in my plush desk chair to read his frantic, venomous words. The messages were a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. Maya, the caterers, just called me. Why haven't the final invoices been cleared from your agency accounts? You know the deadline is today. Do not play games with me right now. This gala is my senior partnership. If you sabotage this because you are having a temper tantrum about our finances, I will personally destroy your agency. I checked the joint accounts and I know you are tapped out. Figure it out. Take out a personal loan. Max out your credit cards. I do not care what you have to do, but you better pay those vendor fees by 5 o'clock. If you embarrass me in front of my partners, I will tell the entire Atlanta real estate community that your business is completely insolvent. I will ruin your professional reputation permanently. Pay the vendors, Maya. Now. I read the barrage of threats, feeling a profound sense of tranquility wash over me. Yesterday, these messages would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have been sobbing frantically, calling banks and begging for emergency credit extensions just to protect my clients and salvage my crumbling marriage. Julian was relying on that exact trauma response. He was banking on my historical tendency to set myself on fire just to keep him warm. I thought he was holding a gun to my head, completely oblivious to the fact that the chamber was empty and I was sitting behind the controls of a drone strike. I was trying to terrify a woman who no longer existed. I slowly traced my manicured finger over the screen, savoring the absolute power imbalance of the moment. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph defending myself. I did not argue about the stolen money or the sheer audacity of his demands. I did not tell him that his mistress's husband was currently funding my entire operation. I refused to give him a single ounce of the desperate, fearful energy he was trying to extract from me. Instead, I tapped the reply box and typed out a short, simple sentence. See you at the gala, honey. I hit send. I watched the tiny indicator confirm that the message had been delivered. I imagined Julian standing in his office, or perhaps lounging in the stolen downtown penthouse, staring at his screen in absolute confusion. He would be waiting for the follow-up text, the angry rant, the tearful concession. He would be waiting for the Maya he had manipulated for 8 years to finally crack and surrender. He would be waiting a very long time. I tapped the settings icon in the top right corner of his contact profile. I scrolled down past his phone number, past our shared location settings, and past the photo of us smiling on our wedding day. I firmly pressed the red button labeled Block Caller. The confirmation prompt popped up on the screen, asking if I was sure I wanted to stop receiving calls and messages from this contact. I pressed confirm without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I set the phone face down on my desk, feeling a heavy, stifling chain physically detach from my soul. The communication line was severed. The financial drain was permanently plugged. The legal shield was fully operational. I stood up from my desk, smoothing out the lines of my emerald green suit, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling Atlanta streets below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows over the city pavement. Julian and his toxic family thought they had successfully executed the perfect financial crime. They thought they had drained the host organism and discarded the remains without consequence. They were currently celebrating their untouchable status, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already been rigged with explosives. I had given them 8 years of unwavering loyalty, financial support, and quiet obedience. Now I was going to give them exactly what they had earned. The countdown to the Pinnacle Group annual charity gala had officially begun, and I was going to ensure it was a night the Atlanta elite would never ever forget. Through the relentless efficiency of Sterling's private investigators, I had a front row seat to the sheer magnitude of Julian and Chloe's delusions. While I spent the next 14 days operating out of a secure boardroom in Sterling's corporate headquarters, they spent it parading around Atlanta's high-end boutiques, completely oblivious to the crosshairs locked on their foreheads. Julian had taken my final text message as a surrender. In his narcissistic mind, my silence meant I had capitulated, that I was scraping together the vendor fees from personal credit cards just to save face and protect my business. He strutted into his brokerage firm every morning with the unearned swagger of a senior partner, accepting premature congratulations from his colleagues. He was the golden boy who had secured the prestigious Grand Magnolia Conservatory. He was the visionary. Chloe was equally intoxicated by her perceived ascension. Sterling's investigators forwarded us high-resolution photographs of her trying on exorbitant couture gowns in Buckhead-swiping credit cards that were rapidly approaching their secret limits. She believed she had successfully traded up, securing a rising real estate titan while retaining the spoils of her billionaire husband. She thought tonight was her coronation into Atlanta's high society, walking on the arm of the man of the hour. They were both drunk on stolen resources and unchecked arrogance. They had no idea that I owned the floor they were about to walk on. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Sterling's glass-walled conference room was cold, clinical, and deadly. Sterling and I stood shoulder to shoulder before a massive digital whiteboard, mapping out the financial autopsy of my husband and his accomplices. We were not just preparing a presentation, we were building a federal indictment. Donovan and his team of forensic accountants had dug past the initial shell company and uncovered a labyrinth of financial rot. Julian had not just used my operating capital to buy the penthouse. That was simply the final destination of the funds. To wash the money and hide it from any immediate marital audits, he had routed my $250,000 through 3 different commercial accounts. Those accounts belonged to Greg. My arrogant, condescending white brother-in-law had knowingly allowed Julian to use his failing property management firm as a laundromat for my stolen life savings. "Look at the timestamp on this transfer," Sterling said, tapping a red stylus against the interactive screen. Greg authorized the wire out of his corporate escrow account on the same day he filed for an emergency commercial loan extension. He was desperate for liquidity to make his own books look solvent for a quarterly review. He let Julian park your money in his accounts to artificially inflate his balance sheet, then washed it out to the limited liability company under Chloe's maiden name. I stared at the digital paper trail, a cold, hard knot of vindication tightening in my chest. Greg had stood in my living room jingling his keys, mocking my intellect and telling me I threw little parties. All while his own business was hemorrhaging cash and relying on my stolen money to stay afloat. He was a fraud, propping up his mediocre existence with the capital I had bled for. We meticulously compiled the documents. We isolated the bank transfer routing numbers, the time-stamped authorizations bearing Greg's digital signature, and the final deed to the penthouse listing Chloe as the sole proprietor. We did not stop there. Sterling provided the definitive proof of the affair, gathering time-stamped security footage from the downtown building, luxury hotel receipts, and digital communication logs. I formatted everything with the precision of a master event planner. I curated the visual slides, ensuring the resolution was flawless. The font was highly legible from the back of a grand ballroom, and the sequence of evidence was absolutely undeniable. We loaded the entire presentation onto a heavy encrypted flash drive. I slipped it into my designer clutch. It was the digital equivalent of a hand grenade. As the sun began to set on the evening of the Pinnacle Group annual charity gala, the level of toxic family coordination reached its absolute peak. Through the social media updates of Julian's younger colleagues and the society pages tracking the event, I watched the pre-gala spectacle unfold. Beatrice was holding court at the Ritz-Carlton lobby bar, surrounded by her country club friends, boasting loudly about her son. She was wearing a brand new diamond tennis bracelet, undoubtedly funded by the very real estate commissions Julian was projecting to earn tonight. She was cementing her status as the mother of the city's newest real estate mogul. Greg and Kendra were equally insufferable. Greg was using Julian's spotlight to network, aggressively trying to secure new investors for his sinking commercial properties by association. He was banking on Julian's elevation to senior partner to save his own neck. They were all operating as a unified parasitic front, completely convinced that their combined superiority had permanently neutralized me. They believed the narrative Julian had sold them. They thought I was a hysterical, inadequate wife who had been rightfully discarded for a more sophisticated upgrade. They thought I was sitting in my dark, empty suburban house crying over unpaid bills and a shattered marriage. They could not have been more wrong. I was standing in the master suite of my luxury hotel, staring at my reflection in a gilded floor-to-ceiling mirror. I was not dressing for a party. I was putting on my armor. The custom designer gown I had commissioned for tonight was a masterpiece of structural elegance. It was a deep, striking sapphire blue that complemented my dark skin perfectly. The heavy silk crepe fabric draped flawlessly across my silhouette, featuring a razor-sharp asymmetrical neckline and a subtle commanding cape feature that cascaded down my left shoulder. It was not a dress meant to blend in. It was a garment designed to dominate a room. My makeup artist had executed a look of flawless, intimidating glamour. Sharp contours, a deep plum lip, and eyes lined to convey absolute, unbothered authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, immaculate structural updo, drawing all focus to the sharp angles of my face and the diamond drop earrings Sterling had insisted I borrow from his personal vault. The diamonds were cold and heavy, a tangible reminder of the untouchable power I now had backing my every move. Sterling stepped into the suite, adjusting the cuffs of his midnight black tuxedo. He looked like a titan of industry, exuding a quiet, lethal authority that commanded respect without requiring a single word. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over my reflection in the mirror. He offered a single approving nod. "Julian is expecting a broken woman," Sterling stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "He is expecting to walk into that venue and take his throne." I picked up my clutch, feeling the solid weight of the encrypted flash drive inside. I turned to face Sterling, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an unreadable mask of. "He is going to walk into a slaughterhouse," I replied. We descended to the hotel lobby and stepped out into the humid Atlanta evening. The black Maybach was waiting at the curb, its engine purring with suppressed power. The driver opened the rear door, and I slid into the luxurious leather interior Sterling, taking the seat beside me. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb and merged into the heavy downtown traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the glittering city skyline. For 8 years, I had shrunk myself to make Julian look bigger. I had muted my ambition to protect his fragile ego. I had tolerated his mother's disrespect and his brother-in-law's condescension, because I believed in the sanctity of family and the promise of a shared future. I had poured my heart, my capital, and my youth into building a man who repaid me by stripping my accounts and replacing me with a status-obsessed mimic. Tonight I was taking it all back. The venue I owned, the event I controlled, the narrative I was about to rewrite. I took a deep, centering breath as the Maybach turned onto the private drive of the Grand Magnolia Conservatory. The valet line was already packed with luxury vehicles. The flash of event photographers' cameras illuminated the grand entrance. The Atlanta real estate elite had arrived to celebrate Julian's crowning achievement. I adjusted my sapphire gown, gripped my clutch, and prepared to deliver the ultimate keynote presentation. The Grand Magnolia Conservatory was a breathtaking symphony of glass and light. Standing just out of sight in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine level, I looked down upon the sprawling botanical ballroom. My agency had executed the design flawlessly. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from suspended floral chandeliers, catching the ambient lighting and casting a soft, opulent glow over the Atlanta real estate elite. Waitstaff in pristine black uniforms circulated with silver trays of champagne, moving seamlessly through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The acoustics of the glass atrium amplified the low hum of networking and the classical string quartet playing near the terrace. It was the perfect stage, and the actors had already taken their marks. Julian stood near the center of the room, positioned strategically close to the senior partners of the Pinnacle Group. He wore a velvet dinner jacket that caught the light, holding a glass of bourbon with practiced ease. He was radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He clapped his colleagues on the shoulder, throwing his head back in laughter, playing the role of the visionary broker to absolute perfection. Standing directly at his side was Chloe. She was draped in a silver sequined gown that clung to her frame, but my eyes immediately locked onto her throat. Resting against her collarbone was a heavy multi-carat diamond tennis necklace. The stones caught the chandelier light flashing with brilliant, expensive clarity. I felt a momentary surge of pure, icy rage. That necklace was not purchased with Julian's commissions. It was purchased with the vendor deposits I had bled for. She was wearing my late nights, my missed weekends, and my stolen operating capital around her neck like a trophy. She preened under the attention, leaning into Julian and whispering in his ear, completely convinced that she had secured her place at the apex of Atlanta high society. Just a few yards away, hovering near the exclusive VIP tables reserved for the firm's top producers, were Beatrice and Greg. Beatrice had wasted no time asserting her dominance. She held a flute of champagne surrounded by the wives of the senior partners, her voice carrying over the low hum of the string quartet. I could hear the sharp, condescending tone of her words echoing up to my vantage point. "She just completely lost her mind," Beatrice was saying, waving her manicured hand with dramatic flair. "It is a tragedy, really." Julian tried so hard to be supportive, but she simply could not handle the pressure of being married to a man with his level of ambition. She had a complete emotional breakdown in her own living room. Julian had to step in and manage her finances just to keep her from ruining herself. It is exhausting for him, but he is such a good man. I took control of the situation perfectly. The women around. Beatrice murmured in sympathetic agreement, sipping their drinks and shaking their heads at my supposed instability. Greg was standing right beside her, nodding vigorously to validate the lie. He was aggressively handing out his business cards to anyone who made eye contact, desperately trying to pawn off his underwater commercial strip malls to the Pinnacle Group executives. He was leveraging Julian's spotlight to mask the stench of his own failing properties. They were feasting on the false narrative of my destruction, building their social capital on the ashes of my reputation. They thought I was sitting at home broken and bankrupt while they celebrated my financial execution. I turned to Sterling. He stood beside me in the shadows, his expression an unreadable mask of lethal composure. He adjusted the cuff of his midnight black tuxedo, his dark eyes locked on his wife, flashing my stolen diamonds on the floor below. "It is time," Sterling stated, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority. "Let us show them who actually owns this room." I nodded, adjusting the heavy silk crepe of my sapphire blue gown. I lifted my chin, rolling my shoulders back. I was no longer the accommodating wife. I was the architect of their ruin. Sterling offered his arm. I looped my hand through it, feeling the solid, immovable strength of his presence. We stepped out of the mezzanine alcove and walked toward the grand, sweeping staircase that descended directly into the center of the botanical ballroom. The double oak doors at the top of the landing swung open, pulled back simultaneously by the venue staff I had personally hired. The moment we stepped into the light, the dynamic in the vast room began to shift. It did not happen all at once. It started as a subtle ripple, a sudden turning of heads, near the base of the staircase. The low hum of networking and laughter began to falter, replaced by a quiet, spreading wave of absolute shock. We began our descent. The sharp, commanding click of my heels against the marble stairs cut through the ambient noise like a metronome. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my gaze sweeping over the crowd with a cold, untouchable detachment. The sapphire gown moved around me like liquid armor, the asymmetrical cape trailing behind me with dramatic, calculated elegance. I felt the collective eyes of the Atlanta elite lock onto us. They were not looking at a broken, hysterical woman. They were looking at a queen walking alongside a titan. The crowd naturally parted as we reached the ground floor, carving a wide, unobstructed path directly toward the center of the room. The string quartet seemed to lower their volume, the musicians sensing the sudden heavy shift in the room's atmosphere. Julian was in the middle of telling a joke to the managing partner of his firm when he noticed the silence. He turned around, the arrogant smile still plastered on his face. The smile died instantly. I watched the exact second his brain tried to process the impossible image standing before him. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hand holding the glass of bourbon began to tremble so violently that the amber liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling onto his velvet dinner jacket. I was looking at me, taking in the designer gown, the immaculate styling, and the sheer unbothered power radiating from my stance. But then his eyes shifted to the man standing beside me. Julian was a real estate broker who desperately wanted to play in the big leagues. He spent his days studying the portfolios of the ultra-wealthy, memorizing the faces of the venture capitalists who controlled the city's commercial development. He knew exactly who Sterling was. Julian had spent the last 3 months preparing a massive multi-million-dollar development pitch to present to a shadow investor tonight. It was the pitch that would guarantee his senior partnership. He needed a whale to fund a sprawling commercial district in Midtown. What he had not realized until this very second was that the anonymous whale investor his partners had been courting was Sterling. I watched the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Julian was standing in a venue he thought he booked, preparing to pitch the deal of a lifetime to the billionaire whose wife he was currently sleeping with. The billionaire who was currently standing with his arm linked through the wife Julian had just robbed. Chloe, oblivious to the corporate dynamics at play, finally turned around. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror when she saw her husband. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers frantically covering the diamond necklace as if she could somehow hide the stolen jewelry from Sterling's piercing gaze. She took a panicked step backward, bumping into a cocktail table and nearly knocking over a tray of glasses. She looked like a trapped animal, her social climber facade instantly shattering into a million pieces of raw panic. Beatrice and Greg had also stopped talking. The group of society wives around them fell dead silent. Beatrice's jaw went slack, her eyes darting frantically between me and the imposing billionaire at my side. The narrative she had just been spinning about my emotional breakdown evaporated into the humid air. She looked completely out of her depth, suddenly realizing that the woman she had treated as a disposable stepping stone was now holding court with the most powerful man in the room. Greg simply stared, his mouth hanging open in dumbfounded silence. The arrogant sneer he had worn in my living room was completely gone, replaced by the panicked realization of a mediocre man who knows he has just walked into an active minefield. Sterling and I did not stop walking. We moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, cutting straight through the parted crowd until we stood a mere 3 feet away from Julian and Chloe. The silence in our immediate vicinity was deafening. The managing partners of the Pinnacle Group, confused by Julian's sudden paralysis, stepped forward to greet the man they desperately needed to impress. Sterling, one of the senior partners, said, extending a hand with a wide, eager smile, "We are incredibly honored you could make it tonight. We have been looking forward to this introduction." Sterling did not look at the senior partner. He kept his dark, lethal gaze locked entirely on Julian. He reached out and shook the partner's hand without breaking eye contact with my husband. "The pleasure is entirely mine," Sterling stated, his rich baritone carrying clearly in the quiet space. "I never miss an opportunity to inspect a potential investment, especially when the broker in charge has such a fascinating approach to asset management." Julian swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of professional greeting to salvage the rapidly disintegrating illusion of his control. But no words came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the blinding headlights of his own destruction. I looked at Julian, letting a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I looked at the spilled bourbon on his jacket, the sweat beading on his forehead, and the absolute terror radiating from his posture. He had told me to go back to throwing parties. He had told me to leave the high-level wealth management to the men. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and dripping with lethal intent. "I hope you are enjoying the venue. I made sure every single detail was executed to absolute perfection." The managing partner, oblivious to the nuclear tension radiating between us, clapped Julian on the back. "Go on, Julian," he urged with an encouraging nod. "Walk Mr. Sterling through the Midtown Commercial District proposal. Show him what the Pinnacle Group can do." Julian looked like a man walking barefoot toward a firing squad. He took a shaky, ragged breath and opened his mouth to speak. His usually smooth, persuasive baritone wavered, instantly cracking on the opening demographic statistics. He fumbled through the projected return on investment numbers, his eyes darting frantically between Sterling's impassive face and my calm, unwavering gaze. He tried desperately to deploy his signature charm, the exact same magnetic charm he had used to manipulate me for 8 years, but it completely evaporated under the bright, unforgiving conservatory lights. He stammered about commercial zoning permits, anchor tenant acquisitions, and tax incentives, sweating profusely into his expensive velvet collar. The presentation was disjointed, pathetic, and entirely devoid of the towering arrogance he had displayed in the downtown penthouse just 24 hours ago. Sterling allowed Julian to stumble through the agonizing, incoherent pitch without a single interruption. He simply stood there, a monolith of power, letting the painful silence stretch for a long, deliberate minute after Julian finally sputtered to a halt. The surrounding VIP tables had gone completely quiet. The attendees, finely tuned to the subtle shifts of corporate power, sensed the heavy, dangerous atmosphere settling over the space. Sterling slowly swirled the clear liquid in his crystal glass. He looked directly at the senior partners of the brokerage, completely bypassing Julian, as if he were nothing more than a stain on the marble floor. When Sterling finally spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant hum that carried effortlessly across the hushed room. "Your firm brought me here tonight to discuss a $50 million capital injection for the Midtown development." Sterling stated, his tone clinically precise and chillingly calm. "As a venture capitalist handling institutional funds, my primary concern is not just the architectural viability of a project, but the absolute, unimpeachable integrity of the brokers managing my capital. A man who cannot manage his own domestic portfolio without resorting to theft is a catastrophic corporate liability." The managing partner frowned, looking back and forth confusedly between Sterling and my sweating husband. "I do not understand, Mr. Sterling. Julian is one of our most aggressive and productive top producers. His record here is exceptional." "Is he?" Sterling asked, his dark eyes finally shifting back to pin Julian in place. "Because a legitimate top producer does not typically need to embezzle $250,000 from his wife's boutique event planning agency just to finance his personal lifestyle." The word embezzle dropped into the opulent botanical ballroom like a live grenade. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the nearby crowd of elites. Chloe instinctively took a sharp step backward, her hand flying to her chest, trying to physically distance herself from the immediate blast zone. Beatrice pressed her hand to her throat, her mouth falling open in sheer horror, as the high society wives she had just been boasting to turned to stare at her son with wide, scandalized eyes. Julian raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Mr. Sterling, please, I assure you this is a private marital dispute. My wife is simply upset about a highly complex investment strategy I initiated for our family's future. She operates a small party planning business, and she does not understand the advanced financial mechanisms involved in commercial property acquisition." "Do not insult my intelligence," Sterling cut in, his voice cracking like a whip through the quiet room. "And do not insult the intelligence of the senior partners standing beside you. Stripping the entire operating capital from a fully incorporated business, forging electronic transfer authorizations, and routing those stolen funds into a shell limited liability company registered under your Mistress's maiden name is not a complex investment strategy. It is wire fraud. It is grand larceny. And it is a matter of federal record." The senior partners physically recoiled from Julian, stepping away, as if he were suddenly radioactive. The managing partner's face turned a mottled shade of dark red as the sheer magnitude of the legal liability standing next to him finally registered. A broker committing federal fraud was an absolute death sentence for a prominent firm's reputation in Atlanta. Sterling continued his clinical dismantling, raising his voice just enough to ensure the entire VIP section heard every single damning word. You are standing in a venue completely funded and controlled by the very woman you robbed. Maya secured this conservatory. She paid the luxury caterers. She arranged the lighting design. You are drinking her champagne while wearing a velvet jacket she subsidized, attempting to pitch my own money back to me. You are not a visionary real estate broker, Julian. You are a common thief wearing a custom suit, and you are entirely unfit to manage a single dollar of corporate capital. Julian was hyperventilating now. He looked around wildly, searching the crowd for an escape route, searching for a single ally to defend him. His entire professional identity, the fake persona he had spent years crafting at my expense, was being flayed alive in front of the exact people he needed to impress. That was when Greg made the absolute worst decision of his entire life. Unable to watch his golden goose burn to the ground and desperate to salvage his own proximity to wealth and power. My white brother-in-law pushed his way through the stunned crowd. Greg puffed out his chest, wearing his unearned privilege like an invisible shield. He stepped directly between Julian and Sterling, attempting to leverage his own business credentials to save the disastrous situation. "Now hold on just a minute," Greg said, his voice loud, booming, and overly confident. "I think we all need to take a step back and breathe here. I am Gregory Vance, founder and chief executive of Vance Property Management. Julian is a man of outstanding moral character. I have worked closely with him on numerous commercial acquisitions over the years. What we have here is a highly emotional woman having a public breakdown and throwing around legal terms she clearly does not comprehend. Julian is a brilliant broker. I personally vouch for his integrity and the massive financial viability of this Midtown project." I stood perfectly still in my sapphire gown, watching Greg dig his own grave with a backhoe. He was relying on the old rules, the traditional rules, where his loud voice and arrogant posturing could silence my reality. He had no idea that Sterling's forensic team had already audited his entire miserable existence. Sterling slowly turned his lethal gaze onto Greg. He looked at my brother-in-law the way a scientist observes a particularly repulsive insect squirming under a microscope. Gregory Vance Sterling repeated, tasting the name with absolute unfiltered disgust. The founder of a property management firm currently carrying $7 million in toxic commercial debt. The man who filed for an emergency commercial loan extension just 3 days ago because 3 of his suburban strip malls are completely underwater and facing imminent foreclosure by the state. Greg stopped breathing. His overly confident posture instantly collapsed, his shoulders slumping as if he had been struck with a baseball bat. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pallid white under the chandeliers. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but no sound emerged from his throat. "You are in absolutely no position to vouch for anyone's financial integrity," Sterling continued smoothly, stepping 1 inch closer to Greg. "In fact, you are the last person in this room who should be speaking right now, because my forensic accountants traced the exact digital path of the $250,000 Julian stole from Maya. It did not go directly to his mistress. It went through your corporate escrow accounts first." The silence in the grand botanical ballroom was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing completely, the cellist resting her bow across her lap. Every single person in the vicinity was hanging on to Sterling's every word. "You knowingly allowed your brother-in-law to use your failing property management firm to wash stolen funds," Sterling announced, his voice echoing with devastating clarity off the glass ceilings. "You acted as a money launderer to hide embezzled capital, likely because you desperately needed the temporary liquidity to make your own books look solvent for your quarterly banking review. You are not a successful property manager. You are a desperate accessory to a federal crime, drowning in bad debt, trying to lecture my business partner on wealth management." Greg physically swayed on his feet. He looked like he was going to vomit right there on the polished marble floor. His eyes darted to the senior partners, to the other wealthy investors in the room, to his wife Kendra, who was standing near Beatrice with her hands covering her face in absolute whimpering mortification. The elite crowd, the very people Greg desperately wanted to belong to, were looking at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You are both finished in this city," Sterling stated, delivering the final fatal blow to their professional lives with cold precision. "I will ensure that every venture capital firm, every private equity group, and every commercial bank in Atlanta sees the full forensic report by tomorrow morning. Your licenses will be revoked, your remaining assets will be liquidated, and you will both be incredibly lucky if you avoid serving time in a federal penitentiary. Sterling turned his back on them, dismissing their entire existence with a single fluid motion. He looked at the managing partners of the Pinnacle Group, who were still standing in stunned, horrified silence, holding their drinks with white-knuckled grips. I highly suggest you evaluate your internal hiring practices, gentlemen, Sterling advised coldly. Because association with this level of financial rot is contagious. Have a pleasant evening. Julian dropped to his knees. His legs simply gave out under the crushing, suffocating weight of his total, irreversible destruction. He knelt on the marble floor of the Grand Magnolia Conservatory, the spilled bourbon soaking through his trousers, surrounded by the disgusted stares of the partners he had worshipped. Greg stumbled backward, grasping the edge of a cocktail table to keep from collapsing his chest, heaving as he realized he had just lost his business, his freedom, and his entire social standing in the span of 3 agonizing minutes. I looked down at Julian, feeling a profound, radiant sense of closure wash over my spirit. He was exactly where he belonged, broken, bankrupt, and publicly exposed as a fraud. The illusion of his superiority had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I did not feel pity. I did not feel sadness. I felt an exhilarating, intoxicating surge of absolute victory. But the night was not quite over. Because Chloe, the woman who had smirked at me from a stolen penthouse while sipping my champagne, was still standing nearby, frantically searching for a way to save herself from the rapidly sinking ship. And I had a very special toast to make. Chloe stood frozen as the reality of Julian's absolute destruction washed over her. She looked at the man she had banked her entire future on, now kneeling in a puddle of spilled bourbon, a disgraced and broken broker. Survival instinct, honed by years of relentless social climbing, kicked in instantly. She realized Julian was a rapidly sinking ship, and she needed a lifeboat before she drowned with him. Her eyes darted wildly around the lavish botanical ballroom, taking in the judgmental glares of the society wives she had just been trying to impress. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and suddenly tears began to stream down her flawless cheeks. She staggered forward, pressing a manicured hand against her chest, staging a masterful theatrical performance of a terrified, trapped woman. She looked at the senior partners, then pointed a trembling finger directly at Sterling. "He is a monster!" Chloe sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly in the quiet conservatory. "He cut off my credit cards. He froze my bank accounts and locked me out of my own home. He trapped me in a marriage with absolutely no financial freedom. I had nothing. Julian was just trying to help me escape an abusive, controlling billionaire. He was protecting me." It was a desperate, highly calculated pivot. She was attempting to reframe Julian's federal wire fraud as a heroic romantic rescue mission, casting Sterling as the villain and herself as the helpless damsel in distress. She wept loudly, burying her face in her hands, hoping the wealthy men in the room would succumb to their archaic savior complexes and swoop in to defend her honor. A few of the older guests shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softening slightly at the sight of a sobbing woman. Beatrice, always eagerly desperate to spin a narrative that exonerated her golden boy, immediately stepped forward. "She is telling the truth," Beatrice cried out, gesturing frantically toward Chloe. "My son is a natural protector. He saw a woman in desperate need and he acted out of compassion. You cannot possibly blame him for having a good heart." I could not let that ridiculous, insulting narrative stand for a single second. I unlinked my arm from Sterling's and stepped forward. Sterling did not move to stop me. He simply watched with a proud, predatory gleam in his dark eyes, yielding the floor entirely to my vengeance. The time for letting other people speak for my reality was over. I walked purposefully toward the grand stage situated at the front of the magnificent botanical ballroom. The crowd parted instantly, giving me a wide, respectful berth as my sapphire blue gown swept elegantly across the polished marble floor. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the main podium, the sharp, authoritative click of my heels commanding total silence from the elite attendees. I stood behind the heavy crystal podium and looked out over the sea of expectant faces. I saw the managing partners of the Pinnacle Group, their faces tight with anxiety. I saw the city's most elite commercial investors. I saw my trembling mother-in-law, my shattered brother-in-law, my ruined husband still on his knees and his weeping, manipulative mistress. I reached out and tapped the microphone, ensuring it was live. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting crisp, clear, and perfectly modulated through the state-of-the-art sound system I had personally rented for this gala. "My name is Maya. I am the founder and chief executive officer of the boutique event planning agency that coordinated every single detail of this beautiful evening. I am also the woman Julian legally married 8 years ago." The vast room remained dead silent, entirely captivated by the raw, crackling tension radiating from the stage. "I understand that commercial real estate is a highly demanding industry." I continued, keeping my tone light, conversational, and entirely lethal. "It requires sharp vision, massive capital, and the courage to make bold, unconventional investments. Julian has spent the last 3 months telling his partners that he is ready for a senior partnership. He has promised you all that he knows how to identify prime assets and execute complex financial mechanisms with flawless precision. Chloe has just graciously informed us that Julian is also a heroic protector of vulnerable women, so I would like to propose a toast." I picked up a glass of champagne that had been resting on the edge of the podium. I raised it high, the crystal catching the brilliant light of the floral chandeliers above me. To the happy new couple, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. To Julian and Chloe, and to the breathtaking, unparalleled audacity of their bold investments. I lowered my glass, my polite smile, vanishing instantly, replaced by a gaze of cold forged steel. Let us take a closer, detailed look at exactly how Julian manages his financial assets. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a small black remote control. I had coordinated this exact moment with the audiovisual technicians earlier that afternoon. I pressed the primary button. The massive overhead lights in the conservatory dimmed to a dramatic cinematic low level. Behind me, an enormous high-definition presentation screen silently descended from the vaulted glass ceiling, spanning 20 feet across the main stage. Julian had expected to use this massive screen to display beautiful architectural renderings of a lucrative midtown commercial district. I was using it to broadcast his financial autopsy. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark room with blinding, undeniable clarity. The first image projected was not a luxury building. It was a high-resolution verified scan of a bank statement from my event planning agency. I retrieved a laser pointer from the podium and directed a sharp red dot to the highlighted row of digits. "As you can see clearly on this document," I stated, my voice echoing powerfully through the speakers, "on Tuesday at 9 in the morning, $250,000 was wired directly out of my business operating account. This was essential capital explicitly earmarked for vendor payroll and corporate event deposits. It was stolen." I clicked the remote. The screen transitioned flawlessly to a complex, perfectly formatted financial flowchart. The diagram showed the stolen funds moving from my business account directly into the commercial escrow accounts belonging to Gregory Vance Property Management. A collective horrified murmur rippled through the distinguished crowd as Greg's corporate logo flashed 20 feet high on the giant screen, securely and publicly tying him to the federal laundering scheme. Greg visibly slumped against a cocktail table, hiding his face in his hands. I clicked the remote again. The next slide displayed a certified, notarized deed of ownership for a luxury penthouse condominium located in downtown Atlanta. I used the laser pointer to highlight the exorbitant purchase price, the cash transaction verification, and the name of the sole proprietor. Chloe's maiden name sat glaringly in bold black ink for the entire city elite to read and digest. "This was not a heroic rescue mission," I announced, projecting my voice over the rapidly growing murmurs of the outraged crowd. "This was not a noble man protecting a financially abused wife from a controlling billionaire. This was a deceitful broker deliberately stealing $250,000 from his own wife's small business to buy a debt-free luxury property for his mistress. He did not rescue her. He funded her." Chloe abruptly stopped crying. Her hands dropped from her flawless face as she stared in absolute paralyzing horror at the undeniable legal documentation of her greed projected brightly for all to see. The theatrical tears dried instantly. She could not spin a sympathetic narrative out of certified bank routing numbers and a finalized property deed. The hard evidence completely destroyed her victim act. To ensure there was absolutely no ambiguity left in the room, I clicked the remote one final time. The screen flashed a perfectly organized grid of high-definition security camera stills, obtained by Sterling's elite private investigators. The crystal-clear photos showed Julian and Chloe entering luxury hotels together, kissing intimately in dimly lit restaurants, and walking hand in hand into the very penthouse my stolen money had purchased. Every single image was clearly time-stamped in the bottom corner, irrefutably proving the affair had been ongoing for many months prior to any frozen assets. The botanical ballroom completely erupted. The polite, hushed whispers of the high society crowd transformed instantly into a deafening cacophony of loud gasps, outraged murmurs, and outright expressions of sheer disgust. The senior partners of the Pinnacle Group looked physically sick, furious that they had brought their most valuable clients to an event coordinated by a common thief. Wealthy investors shook their heads in severe revulsion, physically turning their backs on Julian as if his mere presence would infect their portfolios. Julian and Chloe were no longer a visionary broker and a misunderstood damsel in distress. They were completely stripped of their polished, deceitful facades. They were publicly and undeniably branded as thieves, frauds, and parasitic liars. The entire room, the very high society they had sacrificed my livelihood and my sanity to impress, was looking at them with sheer, unadulterated contempt. Beatrice was weeping silently, finally grasping the inescapable reality of her son's criminality. I stood tall at the podium, bathed in the bright glow of the presentation screen, watching the empire they tried to steal crumble into absolute irreversible dust. I let the images linger on the massive screen, ensuring every person in the room had ample time to absorb the magnitude of the betrayal. The red laser dot remained fixed on the timestamp of a photograph showing Julian and Chloe toasting with champagne glasses on the balcony of the stolen penthouse. That champagne was paid for with my sweat, my late nights, and my unwavering dedication to a man who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource. The silence that had initially gripped the room was now entirely shattered by the harsh reality of the evidence. Several high-profile guests began gesturing for their coats, disgusted by the spectacle of corruption. The managing partner of Julian's firm marched directly toward the exit, refusing to even look in Julian's direction, signaling the immediate and permanent end of Julian's career in the real estate industry. Julian remained on the floor, utterly defeated, while Chloe looked around frantically for an escape route that did not exist. I had promised to burn their world to the ground, and as I stepped away from the podium, I knew the fire was absolute. The managing partner of the Pinnacle Group did not just walk out of the Grand Magnolia Conservatory. He stopped just short of the exit, turned around, and marched right back toward the center of the botanical ballroom, where Julian was still kneeling on the marble floor. The entire room held its collective breath as the titan of Atlanta real estate looked down at my husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are done." Julian, the managing partner, stated, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a guillotine. "You are fired, effective immediately. Your desk will be cleared out by security tonight, and your license will be reported to the state board first thing tomorrow morning. Do not ever contact this firm or any of its affiliates again." Julian looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pleading mutely with the man he had idolized. He reached out a shaking hand, but the managing partner stepped back as if Julian were infected with a deadly virus. "You brought a federal crime to my charity gala." The managing partner continued, his tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "You embezzled from your own wife and used our corporate platform to flaunt it. You are a disgrace to this industry." Without another word, the managing partner turned and walked out the double oak doors, followed swiftly by every other executive in the room. The exodus was absolute. Within 5 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely deserted, leaving only Julie and Chloe, Greg, Beatrice, and Kendra standing in the wreckage of their destroyed social and professional lives. Sterling placed his hand lightly on my lower back, guiding me toward the private exit we had secured for our departure. We did not look back. We stepped into the cool, humid Atlanta night and slid into the waiting Maybach, the heavy doors sealing us off from the toxic waste dump we had just left behind. We had executed the perfect strike. The following morning, I arrived at my boutique event planning agency feeling lighter than I had in 8 years. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my private office, casting a warm golden glow over my desk. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and opened my laptop, checking the secure corporate trust accounts Sterling and Donovan had established. The $750,000 capital infusion sat safely in the bank, a digital fortress protecting my livelihood and my 12 dedicated employees. My personal phone, which I had kept silenced since the gala, was flooded with panicked voicemails and frantic text messages from numbers I had not yet blocked. Julian had called 42 times. Greg had left 3 rambling voicemails begging for a meeting to explain his side of the money laundering scheme. I deleted every single notification without listening to a single second of their desperate backtracking. They had played their hands and lost everything. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the sleek glass door to my suite swung open. My receptionist stood in the doorway looking incredibly flustered and apologetic. "Maya, I am so sorry." My receptionist stammered, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. She pushed right past the lobby desk and I could not stop her. Before I could ask who had bypassed the security protocol, Beatrice shoved her way into my office. The woman standing in front of my desk was a complete shadow of the arrogant, condescending matriarch who had sat on my custom velvet sofa just 2 days ago. Beatrice was not wearing her pristine pearl necklace. Her hair was unkempt, sticking up at awkward angles, and her designer blouse looked wrinkled as if she had slept in it. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy swollen from hours of frantic, terrified weeping. "Maya, please!" Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking as she rushed toward my desk. "You have to stop this. You have to call off the lawyers and the police. You are going to ruin my boy's life." I remained perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, setting my coffee mug down on the glass surface. I did not offer her a seat. I did not offer her a tissue. I looked at the woman who had treated me like a disposable stepping stone for nearly a decade and felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. Julian ruined his own life. Beatrice, I stated my voice perfectly, even and devoid of any emotion. He committed federal wire fraud. He stole my life savings to buy real estate for his mistress. I am simply letting the justice system process his choices. Beatrice slammed her hands flat on my desk, leaning forward with desperate, pleading eyes. "He made a mistake, Maya. He is a good man who just got caught up with the wrong woman. Chloe manipulated him. She used her billionaire husband's connections to poison Julian's mind. He loves you. He has always loved you. If you press criminal charges, he will go to federal prison. They will take his broker license. He will have nothing." "He left me with nothing," I reminded her sharply, leaning forward to meet her panicked gaze. "He drained my accounts and mocked me. And you sat in my living room and told me to be a good wife and support his financial vision. You told me to forgive his little indiscretions. You told me I lacked the intellect to understand his brilliance. I was wrong." Beatrice sobbed, the tears spilling over her eyelashes and dripping onto my clean glass desk. "I was just trying to protect my son." "A mother protects her children, Maya. You have to understand that. Please, I am begging you. Do not take away his freedom. Do not press charges. We are family." Family, I repeated the word, tasting like pure poison. "Let us talk about family, Beatrice. Let us talk about what I have done for this family over the last 8 years." I stood up from my chair, towering over her hunched, defeated frame. "Do you remember 3 years ago when Greg and Kendra were about to lose their house? Greg had made a terrible commercial investment, and their mortgage was 90 days past due. They were facing immediate foreclosure, and Kendra was pregnant with your first grandchild. Julian came to me crying, saying his sister was going to be homeless." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears leaking down her cheeks. "I took $40,000 out of my personal savings to cover their back payments." I continued, my voice rising with years of suppressed resentment. "I paid their mortgage for 6 months, so your daughter would not have to sleep in a motel. I gave them that money as a gift, just to keep the peace in this family." And how did Greg repay me? He stood in my hallway 2 days ago, jingling his car keys, and told me I was going to end up on the street. He laughed at my pain and helped your golden boy launder my stolen money. "I was the bank, Beatrice," I stated coldly, slamming my hand down on the desk. "I was the safety net for your entire parasitic bloodline. I paid for Julian's suits. I paid for his real estate exams. I paid for your expensive birthday dinners at the country club because you demanded to be treated like royalty. I funded your entire existence while you smiled to my face and whispered behind my back about how I was just a simple party planner holding your son back from true greatness. Maya, please, Beatrice wailed, dropping to her knees right there in my private office. She clutched the edge of my desk, sobbing hysterically. I will do anything. I will sell my house. I will give you whatever money I have left. Just call off Sterling. Call off the lawyers. Julian cannot survive in prison. He is not strong enough. He is my baby. I looked down at the weeping, broken woman kneeling on my office floor. This was the matriarch who had tried to dictate my worth. This was the woman who had told me I would never work in Atlanta again if I dared to expose her son. Now she was groveling at my feet, offering to sell her own home just to buy her son's freedom. You should have taught your baby not to steal from the woman paying his bills, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal frozen whisper. Your son is a thief. Your son-in-law is an accessory to money laundering. And you are a toxic enabler who happily consumed the harvest until the crops caught fire. I reached across my desk and pressed the button on my intercom system. Security, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice's horrified face. We have an unauthorized visitor in the executive suite. Please send 2 guards to escort her off the premises immediately. No, Maya, you cannot do this, Beatrice screamed, staggering to her feet as the heavy glass doors to my office swung open. 2 large security guards stepped into the room, flanking her immediately. You are a monster. You are destroying our family out of spite. You destroyed yourselves. Beatrice, I corrected smoothly, returning to my leather chair and picking up my coffee mug. I just turned on the light so everyone could see the rot. The security guards took Beatrice by the arms, firmly but professionally guiding her toward the exit. She thrashed against their grip, screaming my name and hurling insults that echoed down the corporate hallway. I watched her go completely unfazed by her hysterical meltdown. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the quiet peace that settled over my office the moment she was forcibly removed from my presence. They were frantic. They were terrified. They were desperately trying to backtrack and rewrite the narrative to save themselves from the federal consequences of their own unmitigated greed. But there was no going back. The evidence was secured. The corporate attorneys were already drafting the indictments. And Sterling and I were just getting started on finishing the absolute destruction they brought entirely upon themselves. Julian thought he was walking away unscathed, but he was severely mistaken. 3 days passed in a state of glorious, uninterrupted silence. My office was running at maximum efficiency. The gala vendors had all been paid from my new secure trust, and my clients were none the wiser about the personal warfare happening behind the scenes. I thought Julian was busy licking his wounds and figuring out how to avoid a federal indictment. I had underestimated the sheer desperate audacity of a cornered narcissist. They say a rat will chew off its own leg to escape a trap. Julian and Greg decided to try and chew off mine. It happened on a rainy Thursday morning. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final catering menus for a tech summit, when a man in a beige trench coat bypassed my receptionist and walked directly into my office. He did not ask for a meeting. He simply dropped a thick manila envelope onto my glass desk, asked if I was Maya, and walked out the moment I nodded. I stared at the envelope, feeling a sudden prickle of apprehension. I picked it up, slicing the seal open with a silver letter opener. I pulled out the dense stack of legal documents and began to read. It was an emergency summons for mandatory mediation from the Fulton County Family Court. Julian had filed a motion for an expedited division of marital assets. As my eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. Julian was entirely broke. His reputation was annihilated, and he was staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud. But instead of hiring a criminal defense attorney, he and Greg had spent the last 72 hours hunting for a legal loophole to extort me one last time. The motion was a masterpiece of desperate, greedy fiction. Julian was claiming that because we were still legally and formally married, he was entitled to exactly 50% of my event planning agency. But he was not claiming half of the business as it existed before his embezzlement. He was claiming half of the new valuation. When Sterling initiated the corporate poison pill strategy, He had infused my company with $750,000 in venture capital backing. That massive cash injection, coupled with the exclusive contracts I had just secured, had caused the theoretical valuation of my boutique agency to absolutely skyrocket overnight. On paper, my company was now worth millions. Julian was arguing that since the capital infusion occurred during our legal marriage, he was an equal partner in the explosive growth of the business. He was demanding a multi-million-dollar settlement to relinquish his marital claim. I wanted me to buy him out using Sterling's money. It was breathtakingly arrogant. I thought he had trapped me in a jurisdictional gray area, hoping family court would force a financial settlement before the federal authorities could finalize their criminal investigation into his theft. I picked up my phone and dialed Donovan, the lead corporate attorney Sterling had assigned to my case. Donovan answered on the second ring, sounding completely unbothered. I told him about the summons reading the specific financial demands Julian had outlined. Donovan actually chuckled. I could hear the sound of him typing rapidly on his keyboard. Julian is playing checkers while we are playing chess. Donovan stated, his voice smooth and incredibly dangerous. He thinks he found a back door into the corporate trust. He is trying to force a swift mediation settlement so he can grab a few $1 million and flee the jurisdiction before the federal indictments drop. Greg is absolutely orchestrating this. It reeks of desperate commercial real estate tactics. Do I have to attend this mediation? I asked, gripping the legal summons tightly. You do, Donovan replied. And you are going to put on an award-winning performance. You are going to walk into that mediation room and let Julian and Greg think they have successfully backed you into a corner. Let them lay out their extortion demands on the official mediation record. We want them arrogant. We want them greedy. We want them completely relaxed right up until the moment we drop the anvil on their heads. The mandatory mediation was scheduled for the following Tuesday at a high-end dispute resolution firm in Buckhead. The office was designed to project calm neutrality, featuring soothing beige walls, plush ergonomic chairs, and large windows overlooking the lush tree canopy. It was an environment crafted to de-escalate tension, but the moment I walked into the designated conference room, the air felt thick and suffocating. Julian was already sitting at the long mahogany table. He was wearing a navy blue suit that looked slightly less crisp than usual, but he was trying his hardest to project the aura of a successful businessman. Sitting directly to his right, acting as his unofficial financial proxy, was Greg. Greg wore a smug, satisfied grin that stretched from ear to ear. They looked like two starving wolves who had just cornered a wounded rabbit. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting in a cage with a lion. I took my seat across from them, resting my designer handbag on the empty chair beside me. I maintained a posture of guarded hesitation, deliberately looking down at my hands and avoiding direct eye contact. I was giving them exactly the performance Donovan had requested. I was playing the role of the terrified, overwhelmed wife who had finally realized she was legally outmatched. The court-appointed mediator, a stern white woman with silver hair and a thick binder of case notes, took her seat at the head of the table. She began reciting the standard rules of engagement, outlining the goals of reaching a mutually beneficial financial settlement without going to trial. I barely heard her. All my focus was locked on the subtle, arrogant movements of the two men sitting across from me. Julian leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. Maya, he began, his tone dripping with fake diplomatic concern. I know emotions are running incredibly high right now. The gala was a disaster and things got out of hand. But we have to look at the reality of our legal union. We built your business together. I supported you for years, and now your agency has secured massive venture capital backing. That capital is a marital asset. I am simply asking for my fair share so we can both walk away cleanly. Greg chimed in immediately, not even bothering to hide his absolute greed. Let us cut the emotional nonsense and talk numbers, Maya, Greg said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Julian has a legitimate 50% claim to the new valuation of your agency. We have had independent analysts look at the corporate restructuring. With the new capital, your company is valued at roughly $4.2 million. Julian is entitled to $2.1 million. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. When I finally spoke, $2.1 million. You know I cannot simply write you a check for that amount. The venture capital is tied up in operational trusts. You stole my liquid cash. How am I supposed to pay you millions of dollars, Julian? Greg smiled, his pale blue eyes gleaming with predatory delight. We are reasonable people, Maya. We know you cannot liquidate the trusts immediately, so we have drafted a structured buyout agreement. Julian will accept a lump sum payment of $1 million today, sourced directly from your new investor. In exchange, Julian will sign away his remaining marital rights to the business, and we will call it even. They were trying to extort Sterling through me. They thought I would panic at the thought of a protracted family court battle and simply beg my billionaire backer to pay Julian $1 million to go away. They thought they had found the ultimate leverage. Julian looked at me with a sickening expression of triumph. He thought he had outsmarted the billionaire. He thought he had outsmarted me. He believed he was going to walk out of this mediation room, a millionaire, leaving me to deal with the messy aftermath of his financial crimes. $1 million, Julian, I said softly, finally lifting my head to look him directly in the eyes. You destroy our marriage, you steal my savings, you publicly humiliate me, and now you want $1 million reward for your behavior. It is just business, Maya. Julian replied, his voice devoid of any human empathy. You should have read the Georgia marital property laws before you let a billionaire park his money in your company. I hold the legal claim. You can either sign the settlement agreement today, or I will file an injunction to freeze your entire agency until the divorce goes to trial. Your choice. Pay me or lose everything again. The smug satisfaction radiating from Julian and Greg was absolutely nauseating. They were basking in their perceived victory, entirely convinced that they had executed the perfect legal maneuver. They thought they had me completely boxed in with no escape route and no options left but total financial surrender. I looked at the mediator, who was watching the exchange with professional detachment, waiting for my response. I looked back at Julian, absorbing the pure, unadulterated arrogance on his face. I did not say a word. I simply reached into my handbag, pulled out my phone, and sent a single blank text message to Donovan. The stage was set. The trap was fully loaded. Julian and Greg had proudly marched themselves right to the center of the kill zone, and all I had to do now was wait for the hammer to drop. The heavy oak door to the mediation room did not simply open. It was pushed ajar with a slow, deliberate force that immediately sucked the air out of the space. The court-appointed mediator stopped mid-sentence, her pen hovering over her legal pad. Julian and Greg turned around in their plush ergonomic chairs, their smug, self-satisfied expressions freezing instantly. Sterling stepped into the room. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that seemed to absorb the light, radiating an aura of absolute, uncompromising power. He did not acknowledge the mediator. He did not look at Greg. He did not even glance at Julian. His dark eyes met mine across the long mahogany table, a silent confirmation that the trap was about to snap shut. He walked with predatory grace to the center of the table, right between where I sat and where my extortionists were stationed. Without uttering a single syllable, Sterling raised his hand and dropped a thick, heavy manila envelope onto the polished wood. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the dead silent room. The mediator cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. Excuse me, sir, this is a closed, confidential mediation session. You cannot be in here. I am not here to negotiate a marital settlement, Sterling stated, his deep baritone voice vibrating with absolute authority. I am here to deliver a courtesy notification before I hand this envelope over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian's face went completely ashen. He stared at the thick brown envelope as if it contained a live explosive. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the arrogant smirk melting off his face, replaced by the sudden nervous twitch of a man who suddenly realizes he has wandered into the deep end of the ocean. In the back corner of the large conference room, sitting in a leather guest chair she had insisted on occupying to provide moral support for her golden boy, Beatrice gasped. She clutched her designer purse to her chest, her eyes darting frantically from Sterling to Julian. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking, trying to muster a shred of his former bravado. "You cannot just walk in here and threaten us. We are in the middle of a legal proceeding. I am entitled to my share of Maya's agency." "You are entitled to a minimum security prison cell," Julian Sterling corrected coldly. He reached out and flipped the flap of the manila envelope open, spilling a mountain of certified bank records, printed emails, and forensic accounting ledgers across the table. You see, Julian made a very critical error when he decided to embezzle $250,000 from his wife's business. Sterling continued, turning his gaze to the mediator, then back to the two sweating men. He assumed that was his only financial crime. But when you deploy a team of elite corporate forensic accountants to track stolen funds, they do not just stop at the first layer of dirt. They dig until they hit bedrock. Sterling tapped a thick stack of papers with his index finger. These documents prove that your theft from Maya's agency was not an isolated incident. It was a desperate attempt to cover up a much larger, much older criminal enterprise. Julian, you did not just steal from your wife to buy a penthouse for my wife. You embezzled over $1 million in earnest money deposits from your former real estate clients over the past 3 years. The room plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. I sat perfectly still, watching the complete destruction of my husband's false reality. Earnest money. The funds clients put down in good faith to secure commercial properties. Julian had been illegally draining his clients' escrow accounts to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle, the designer bags, the luxury vacations, the expensive dinners. He had been robbing his own clients blind. "That is a lie!" Julian shouted, slamming his hands on the table, though his entire body was shaking violently. "You manufactured those documents. You are just trying to intimidate me into dropping my claim on Maya's business." Sterling ignored him completely, pivoting his lethal attention directly to Greg. Greg was sitting perfectly rigid, a cold sweat breaking out across his pale forehead. "The problem with embezzling client funds, Julian, is that you cannot just deposit $1 million into your personal checking account without triggering federal banking alerts," Sterling explained, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "You needed a laundromat. You needed someone with a high-volume commercial business who could filter the stolen money through legitimate-looking vendor payments and property maintenance invoices." Sterling slid a specific stack of highlighted bank statements directly in front of Greg. "You used Gregory Vance Property Management," Sterling stated, looking down at my white brother-in-law with unfiltered disgust. "Greg knowingly allowed you to funnel stolen earnest money through his corporate shell accounts. Greg took a 20% cut of the stolen funds to artificially inflate his failing business ledgers, keeping his underwater strip malls from going into immediate foreclosure. Then he washed the remaining 80% out to offshore accounts accessed by Chloe." Greg stopped breathing. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost under the fluorescent conference room lights. He reached out with trembling hands and pulled the bank statements closer. His eyes darted across the pages, reading the routing numbers, the time-stamped wire transfers, and the digital signatures authorizing the movement of stolen capital. His own signatures. "You are both named as co-conspirators in a massive federal money laundering and wire fraud scheme," Sterling concluded, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is not a family court matter anymore, gentlemen. This is a RICO case." The illusion of their unified toxic family loyalty shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. The survival instinct of a cornered coward is a vicious thing to witness. Greg violently pushed his chair back from the table, the heavy piece of furniture tipping over and crashing onto the floor. He lunged at Julian, grabbing him by the lapels of his navy blue suit, hauling him halfway out of his seat. "You told me this money was clean!" Greg screamed, his face turning a blotchy, furious crimson, his spittle flying into Julian's face. "You told me you were just moving overseas investment capital to avoid high domestic tax rates. You said it was a standard real estate workaround. You used my accounts to wash stolen client money. You set me up to take the fall for a federal crime." Julian shoved Greg back, his own panic erupting into absolute frantic rage. "Do not play the innocent victim, Greg," Julian shouted back, his voice echoing loudly off the beige walls. "You knew exactly what we were doing. You happily took your 20% cut every single month. You begged me for more transfers when the bank threatened to repossess your suburban properties. You are just as guilty as I am." "I did not steal from clients," Greg roared, stepping forward to shove Julian hard against the mahogany table. "My business is ruined. My life is over. Kendra is going to leave me, and I am going to a federal penitentiary because you wanted to play sugar daddy to a billionaire's wife. I will testify against you, Julian. I will hand the FBI every single ledger they ask for. I will wear a wire. From the back of the room, Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled out of her guest chair and ran toward the table, physically throwing herself between the two brawling men. Her perfect matriarchal facade was completely obliterated. "Stop it!" Beatrice screamed, slapping at Greg's hands to get him away from her golden boy. "Both of you stop it right now. This is not Julian's fault. He is a good man. He was manipulated." Beatrice turned her wild, tear-filled eyes toward Sterling, pointing a shaking finger at him. "It is that woman," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "Chloe. That wicked gold-digging woman corrupted my son. She demanded expensive things. She forced Julian to find extra money to keep her happy. Chloe is the real thief here. She manipulated my boy into making bad choices. Julian is a victim of her greed." Greg let out a harsh, barking laugh of pure disbelief. "Your son is a parasite, Beatrice. He has been stealing from Maya for years, and when he ran out of her money, he started stealing from strangers. He ruined my family to fund his affair." "You are a failure, Greg." Beatrice spat back, her face twisted in ugly defensive rage. "You could not even keep your own business afloat without my son's help. You took the money eagerly, and now you want to throw Julian to the wolves to save your own pathetic skin. You are no better than a common rat." The mediation room descended into total absolute anarchy. The unified front that had ambushed me in my living room, the arrogant duo that had sat smirking at me just 10 minutes ago, was tearing itself apart in a vicious every man for himself brawl. Greg was screaming at Julian, threatening to ruin him in court. Julian was screaming back, blaming Greg for being a willing accomplice. Beatrice was sobbing and yelling, trying to physically shield Julian while hurling vicious insults at Greg and Chloe. The court-appointed mediator had pressed herself back against the far wall, her eyes wide with shock, clutching her binder to her chest. She was completely paralyzed, having never witnessed a domestic dispute escalate into a violent confession of federal money laundering. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my hands resting calmly on the table. I did not say a word. I did not flinch. I just watched them burn. For 8 years, they had treated me as a lesser being. They had drained my resources, mocked my intelligence, and demanded my absolute obedience. They had built an entire ecosystem of wealth and status on the foundation of my labor and Julian's theft. And the moment the lights were turned on, the moment real, unmitigated consequences were introduced, they turned into feral animals willing to cannibalize each other just to survive. Sterling stood beside me, an immovable pillar of calm in the center of the hurricane. He looked down at me, a silent communication passing between us. We had not just defeated them, we had fundamentally broken their entire reality. They were no longer worrying about dividing my event planning agency. They were realizing that their lives as free elite citizens of Atlanta were completely and permanently over. I watched Greg throw another shove at Julian, knocking a water pitcher off the table where it shattered against the floor. I watched Beatrice drop to her knees, weeping hysterically as her golden boy's empire crumbled into dust. The extortion attempt was officially dead, and the real negotiations, the ones that would leave Julian with absolutely nothing, were about to begin. Sterling brought his hand down flat against the polished mahogany table. The sharp crack of flesh against dense wood sounded like a gavel dropping in a courtroom. The explosive noise instantly severed the chaotic shouting match. Greg stopped mid-sentence, his fist still gripping the lapel of Julian's ruined suit. Beatrice froze, her hysterical sobbing cutting off into a sharp, terrified gasp. The court-appointed mediator remained pressed against the far wall, wide-eyed and completely silent. The sheer gravitational force of Sterling's presence sucked the remaining oxygen from the room, demanding absolute submission. I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in front of me. I looked at the pathetic, fractured remnants of the family that had spent 8 years trying to convince me I was inferior. They were disheveled, sweating and panting like cornered animals. I reached into my designer handbag and withdrew a sleek black leather folder. I placed it on the table and opened it, revealing a crisp stack of legally binding documents prepared by Donovan and his team of corporate sharks. "Sit down, Julian," I commanded, My voice did not shake. It carried the cold, absolute authority of a woman who held the executioner's switch. Julian slowly released Greg's suit jacket. He staggered backward, his knees trembling, and collapsed heavily into his ergonomic chair. He looked at the documents resting in front of me, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. Greg scrambled backward, putting as much physical distance between himself and Julian as the room would allow, his chest heaving with sheer panic. "You have exactly one chance to walk out of this building without federal handcuffs," I stated, sliding the thick contract across the mahogany surface until it rested directly under Julian's nose. "This is an ironclad post-nuptial agreement. By signing this document, you are legally surrendering any and all claims to my event planning agency, my corporate assets, and my personal wealth. You are walking away from this marriage with absolutely nothing. Furthermore, you will authorize the immediate return of my $250,000 from your hidden offshore accounts. You have 24 hours to ensure those funds clear into my trust." Julian stared at the bold legal print, his jaw working silently. "Maya, please," he rasped, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. "I have nothing left. If I give the money back, I am completely bankrupt. The brokerage fired me. I have no income. You are leaving me on the street." I leaned forward, locking my gaze onto his terrified eyes. "You put yourself on the street, Julian. You stole my life savings to buy a penthouse for another man's wife. You looked me in the eye and told me to go back to throwing parties. You arrogant, parasitic coward. You thought you could bleed me dry and discard me. You have exactly 30 seconds to sign that agreement, or Sterling hands the entire forensic dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You can either be broke and free, or broke and serving 10 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. Choose." Julian looked at Beatrice, desperately seeking his mother's intervention, but the matriarch simply wept into her hands, completely powerless against the crushing weight of the evidence. He looked at Greg, who aggressively averted his eyes, entirely focused on his own desperate survival. Julian was completely and utterly alone. With a trembling, defeated hand, he picked up the pen resting on the table. He pressed the tip to the signature line and signed his name, officially signing away his entire fraudulent empire. Sterling collected the documents with a brisk, efficient motion, securing them inside his suit jacket. We stood up in unison, leaving the shattered, toxic family sitting in the ruins of their own making. We walked out of the mediation room and pushed through the heavy double doors into the expansive, brightly lit reception lobby. Waiting in the lobby, pacing nervously back and forth across the carpet, was Chloe. She had not been allowed inside the confidential mediation session, but she had been waiting for Julian to emerge victorious. When she saw Julian stumble out of the conference room behind us, looking like a broken, destitute shell of a man, her survival instincts flared. She took one look at Sterling's immaculate, unbothered posture and instantly calculated the shifting power dynamics. Julian was a sinking ship, and she was desperate to scramble back aboard a luxury yacht. "Sterling!" Chloe cried out, her voice dripping with manufactured desperation and false remorse. She ran across the lobby, throwing herself toward him, attempting to grab his arm. "Sterling, please listen to me. Julian brainwashed me. He manipulated me into going along with his sick financial schemes. I was terrified of him. I never wanted any of this. Please take me back. We can fix our marriage. I belong with you." Sterling stepped smoothly out of her reach, letting her stumble awkwardly forward. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly, terminally bored. He raised his hand, and Donovan, who had been waiting quietly near the elevators, stepped forward. Donovan held a single slim manila envelope. He extended his arm and pressed the envelope firmly against Chloe's chest. "You have been served," Donovan stated crisply. Chloe stared down at the envelope in sheer horror. "What is this?" she stammered, her flawless makeup beginning to crack under the strain of absolute panic. "Those are your divorce papers," Sterling replied, his voice echoing coldly through the reception lobby. "I suggest you read the infidelity clause of our prenuptial agreement very carefully. Your deliberate, documented affair with a third-rate real estate broker has triggered a total asset forfeiture. You are receiving zero alimony. You are permanently locked out of all residential properties, and your access to my corporate accounts has been permanently revoked. You are leaving this marriage with the exact same net worth you had when you entered it. Absolutely nothing." Chloe dropped to her knees right there in the middle of the dispute resolution firm's lobby. She wailed a loud, ugly, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated defeat. She looked back at Julian, her former partner in crime, who simply stared at her with vacant, dead eyes. They had tried to steal an empire, and they had both ended up with absolutely nothing. Sterling offered me his arm, and we walked out of the building, stepping into the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight, completely free from the parasites that had tried to drain us. 6 months later, the air in Atlanta had turned crisp and cool, mirroring the refreshing, absolute clarity of my new life. The landscape of my existence had fundamentally and gloriously transformed, while the people who tried to bury me had reaped the exact harvest they had sown. The federal investigation had eventually caught up with Julian and Greg, largely due to the massive, undeniable paper trail they had sloppily left behind in their panic. While they managed to avoid prison time by liquidating every single asset they owned and cooperating fully with the authorities, the Internal Revenue Service showed them absolutely no mercy. Julian was currently working a minimum wage retail job at a home improvement store just outside the city limits. His wages were being aggressively garnished by the federal government to pay off massive fraud penalties and back taxes. The charismatic, arrogant broker who had mocked my intellect was now wearing a brightly colored vest and helping customers locate plumbing supplies. Chloe had abandoned him the very same week the divorce papers were finalized. Realizing Julian was entirely broke and permanently blacklisted from the real estate industry, she packed whatever clothes she could carry and fled to a cheap, cramped apartment in a different state, stripped of her designer wardrobe and her high society status. Greg and Kendra had faced a similarly brutal downfall. In order to pay the exorbitant legal fees required to keep Greg out of a federal penitentiary, they were forced to sell their sprawling custom-built suburban home. They downsized to a tiny rented townhouse, their country club memberships revoked, and their social standing completely annihilated. Beatrice, the arrogant matriarch who had treated me like a walking ATM, had become a total social pariah. The true story of her son's embezzlement and her own toxic enabling had spread through the Buckhead elite like wildfire. She rarely left her home now, far too ashamed to show her face among the women she used to boast to. Meanwhile, my boutique event planning agency had officially become the premier undisputed event firm in the entire city of Atlanta. The Pinnacle Group Gala had been a resounding, massive success, entirely credited to my flawless execution under extreme pressure. With Sterling's initial venture capital backing and my own relentless work ethic, we had expanded into commercial corporate retreats, high-level charity functions, and exclusive society weddings. I had paid back Sterling's initial investment with interest, securing my absolute financial independence. I bought a beautiful modern loft in Midtown, decorated exactly to my taste, filled with light peace and the undeniable proof of my own resilience. On a Friday evening, I walked into one of Atlanta's most exclusive high-end steakhouses. The maitre d' greeted me by name and escorted me to a private velvet-lined booth in the back of the restaurant. Sterling was already seated nursing a glass of bourbon. He looked up as I approached, a genuine warm smile breaking across his striking features. Our strictly strategic alliance had evolved organically over the past 6 months into a profound, mutually respectful friendship. There was no romance between us, no blurred lines or complicated feelings. It was a partnership built on absolute integrity, shared ambition, and the unique, unbreakable bond of two people who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the trenches and emerged victorious. To the most successful CEO in Atlanta, Sterling said, raising his glass as I took my seat. I reviewed the quarterly reports for your agency, Maya. You are exceeding every single projection. I smiled, raising my own glass of vintage champagne to meet his. To ruthless partnerships and unbreakable boundaries, I replied. The crystal glasses chimed musically together, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. As the waiter approached to pour my water, my personal cell phone buzzed softly inside my designer clutch. I pulled the device out and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the phrasing instantly. Maya, please, I am so sorry. I made the biggest mistake of my entire life. I miss you. I miss our life. I am struggling so hard right now, and I just need someone to talk to. Please, can we just get coffee? I know I do not deserve it, but I need you. Julian. I sat back against the plush velvet booth, staring at the glowing text message. 6 months ago, receiving a message like this from my husband would have sent me into an emotional tailspin. I would have felt a surge of validation, a pang of pity, or a rush of burning vocal anger. I would have crafted a long, scathing reply, eager to twist the knife and remind him of exactly how badly he had failed. But as I read the pathetic, groveling words of the man who had tried to destroy me, I realized something incredibly beautiful. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger. There was no sadness. There was no lingering desire for revenge. Looking at his name on my screen felt like looking at a stranger's typo. The profound, suffocating hold he and his toxic family once had over my emotions was completely and permanently severed. I smiled, a gentle, peaceful expression of total liberation. I tapped the screen, selected his contact information, and pressed block. I did not type a reply. I did not send a witty comeback or a cruel reminder of his minimum wage reality. I simply erased his digital presence from my device, setting the phone face down on the pristine white tablecloth. "Everything all right?" Sterling asked, taking a sip of his bourbon. "Everything is perfect," I replied, looking out over the softly lit, elegant restaurant. I picked up a menu, my mind completely clear, my heart entirely light and my future stretching out before me, brilliant and fiercely my own. The ultimate victory was not the money, the corporate success, or even the devastating downfall of the people who betrayed me. The ultimate victory was realizing that they simply no longer mattered at all.